Morning. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2023 Track 3 Stakeholder Call to discuss the Track 3 Consolidated Revised Straw Proposal, which was posted on November 11th. My name is Elena Coppola-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that all these materials are available on the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2023 initiative page. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com, navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top, selecting Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to our initiative landing page. And from that page, you'll be able to navigate to the IP initiative page, and these latest documents will be toward the top. So a few housekeeping reminders before we get started. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This collaborative meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but please keep your comments professional and respectful, and please try to refrain from repeating what's already been said so we can manage our time efficiently. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. They're listed as Interlore Events, and today's producer is Stacy. So to raise your hand, make sure you navigate to the bottom right of WebEx and you open the participant panel and the chat panel. And the raise hand icon is at the bottom of that participant panel. If you dialed in outside of WebEx, you can press *3 to get into the question queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation anytime you're unmuting to make a comment or ask a question. And if you're adding a question into the chat, you can send it to all panelists or you can send it to me. Okay, our agenda for today, Bob is going to start us off with modifications to TPD allocation. Danielle will go over long lead time generation resources. We're going to take a break for lunch. And after lunch, Robert is going to cover intra-cluster prioritization and interim deliverability. And then Danielle will go over next steps. So the meeting objective is to answer questions and respond to stakeholder feedback on the revised straw proposal for modifications to the TPD allocation process and consider possible exceptions or extensions for certain long lead time location constrained resources, and then to discuss the revised straw proposal for intra-cluster prioritization and modifications to priority for interim deliverability. So we had these as two different straw proposals, and they're combined into one consolidated one now. So here's where we are in the process. Having posted the revised straw proposal, we're here before working on a draft final proposal. So I'm going to hand it over to Bob Emmett.
All right. Thank you, Elena. Let's go to the next slide. And I will inform everybody, we did repost this presentation. We did add some slides at the very end. We probably won't have time to actually go over those slides, but wanted to provide some clear reference on how to deal with the various security deposits that are required for cluster 15. There seems to be some level of confusion, even though we put out, I think, some pretty good instructions on how to deal with it. But so we are basically, again, providing, it's not new information, it's just reiterating the information related to how to be successful at making sure that you have the various study deposits and commercial readiness deposits and the application fee and so forth, how to make sure that you're going to be successful in getting that done by the close of the window and what the minimum requirement is by the close of the window, and then what is the final requirement before we start the study. So that's at the very end of this presentation. So please take a look at that and share that with the financial folks that will be doing those financial posting items. So to get into the end, again, I'm Bob Emmert, Senior Manager of Interconnection Resources at the ISO. So I wanted to start out with this presentation talking about what the changes are for projects in clusters prior to cluster 15. And so there are minimal changes, but a few changes. So I wanted to make sure everybody understands this, that, well, and also to back up, our typical process has been to have an allocation cycle begin. We had proposed this to have it begin every March, but we've made some adjustments to that for the next few years. We've talked about that in prior IKE meetings, and so just want to kind of reiterate that again, that because of how things are playing out for cluster 15, we have delayed the cycle for 2025 to where the postings or the actual request window will close on September 1st. And since that delays the 2025 TPD allocation cycle for a significant period of time until late in the year, and actually the allocations will likely come out early in 2026, we are anticipating skipping the 2026 allocation year, and then the following allocation year would be 2027. So just to describe that, so that'll kind of play out as I go through this presentation. If you remember how those will play out, that would be helpful. So for the pre-cluster 15 projects, the 2025 TPD allocation cycle maintains the current allocation groups A, B, C, and D. And the 2025 allocation cycle will be the last opportunity for energy-only projects to seek an allocation to either the PPA or the short list allocation groups. And as we go through additional slides, we'll understand that a little bit more. And I'm going to ask everybody just to hold off on questions until I go through about the next 4 slides. I want to be able to provide information on the whole process before we actually open it up for questions, so that people have hopefully a more broad understanding as we go through this. So the next allocation cycle begins with the allocation cycle following the 2025 cycle, which is expected to be 2027. And that's when the new proposal that we have that begins on the next slide will begin to take place. Cluster 14 will be able to seek an allocation in Group D in 2025, and any project receiving the Group D allocation can only retain it with a PPA in the next allocation cycle in 2026. So that's probably the main change, and you'll understand that better as we go through the next slides. Projects that select Group D could continue to be subject, or would continue to be subject to the Group D restriction. So basically, everything's pretty much remaining the same for prior to Cluster 15 projects. So let's move to the next slide. So this is our proposal that will begin in 2027 and could include Cluster 15 projects depending on a particular situation in 2027. So the first allocation group will be the PPA group, which is formerly Group A. We are renaming these groups as we described in the prior paper to make them descriptive so that people really understand the allocation group rather than to have to look up what does the various lettered group names really stand for. So this PPA group will be for projects that have a PPA that meet the existing PPA requirements of the tariff. We aren't changing those PPA requirements, so those will remain the same. The second priority group will be the commercial operation group, which is formerly Group C. So you can see we are no longer going to have the shortlist allocation group. And this commercial operation group will be for eligible energy-only projects that go into commercial operation. The third priority group will be the conditional group. This is a new group, very similar to Group D, but it does not have the current Group D restrictions related to not being able to change your COD and some other items. So we're removing those restrictions. We'll maintain Group D as a legacy allocation group. So this conditional group will be a new allocation group that will become available for Cluster 15 and later projects. So within this allocation group, all projects without a PPA would by default be included in the conditional allocation process. with the scoring process determining the order projects receive their TPD allocation. So different from the allocation group D, where some projects may have said, I don't want to be under the restrictions of group D, so they did not participate in the group D allocations. In this case, without the restrictions, everybody's going to want to be included in this conditional allocation process unless they have a PPA. There's no reason, there's no issue that would hinder any project anyway. So we'll be allocating basically all of the TPD available behind a particular POI to the group projects within those areas if we have that full amount of capacity at each of these POIs. The conditional allocations must be retained by the following TPD allocation cycle with a executed eligible PPA. So similar to Group D, the allocations for within the allocation group are good for 1 year and must be retained at the end of that year with either, well, in this case, they must have a PPA. However, if not retained, just like allocation group D, projects can reseek an allocation as long as the project's cluster is eligible to seek an allocation. So the conditional TPD allocation group will reduce the available TPD used to determine the amount of capacity that will be studied in the next cluster. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this slide speaks to some of the ways that we see the benefits of this proposal. What does it actually accomplish? So it simplifies a complicated process for developers, load serving entities, and the ISO. It creates a simplified two-step TPD track for all projects where basically it's either conditional group or PPA. No middle ground step of having a short list, which we think will really benefit the procurement process to where the load serving entities that are looking at projects will be, it'll be easier for them to determine which projects have an allocation, where they stand within the process, and it'll make that much more black and white and for them to be able to really evaluate the projects that they are looking at. All eligible projects without a PPA would automatically be processed for an allocation through the conditional allocation group. It eliminates the prolonged two-step retention process. It simplifies a complex project allocation tracking process to where on the ISO side, it's gotten very complicated. We have a tracking process that we've developed that is getting more and more complex through the years, and this particular process will vastly simplify that process, which is something that we've really seen internally that we need to do something differently or otherwise build an elaborate relational database to be able to track this process. And it ends the tracking of conditional groups projects, or really the Group D allocations, where we are having to track their CODs and other restrictions for Group D projects. It maximizes the capacity able to be to compete for a PPA within each cluster to meet the accelerated procurement targets within without risk to developers. And what that means, that without risk to developers, they can be involved in the conditional allocation group without any risk, without having to worry about, is my COD the right COD for me to be able to move forward in this process, and that type of thing. And it puts the bilateral procurement process in the driver's seat for determining the value and viability of projects competing for a PPA. It creates a level playing field in procurement, with most projects having a conditional TPD allocation, and allows procurement to focus on other high-value project attributes. What that means is it'll be obvious to the load-serving entities which projects have an allocation and how long that allocation is good for, so that they can focus on other project attributes rather than worrying about, okay, is this project going to be fully deliverable or not? Do I need to do some analysis on my end to determine the likelihood that a project might be able to be to achieve full capacity delivery status or not. And let's move to the next slide. So as we described previously, project parking will be discontinued. And one of the main reasons or benefits of parking has been that projects that park do not have to make their, under the current process, their second interconnection financial security posting. But under the new FERC order requirements, projects are required within a certain time frame after the studies are done to go ahead and enter into their LGIA and make their GIA financial security postings. So by default, the main benefit of parking has been taken away by the FERC order 2023. So projects must make any required increases to their commercial readiness deposit following the completion of the cluster studies on the dates required by the ISO's FERC order number 2023 compliance filing. So this next item is a pretty key component is, under the current process, projects could have up to 3 opportunities to seek an allocation. They can seek an allocation right after the phase 2 studies are done. If they don't get an allocation, they can park for 1 year and then go back and have a second opportunity. And then under certain conditions, some projects could actually seek an allocation or park a second year and seek an allocation for the third time. And for cluster 14, no projects met that condition to be able to park a second year. So that second year of parking is becoming kind of non-existent under the current situation. So in this process, projects will have 3 consecutive opportunities to seek an allocation with no restrictions. The first opportunity would be in the request window following the cluster's facility study report being issued. The vast majority of projects will need their facilities report cost information to definitively market their project for a PPA. That's something we heard pretty clearly from stakeholders in their comments, that providing anything earlier in that would be, not many projects would be able to participate in an earlier allocation process. However, we do want to ask stakeholders about, should we actually have a potential option for to provide an opportunity to projects to have to get an allocation if they have a PPA, and they get that PPA before the facility studies are done. So every year there will be an allocation cycle that takes place during the facility study. And while it could be very rare that projects would truly be ready and actually have been able to get an allocation based on the information received from their study reports out of the initial cluster studies and the reassessment, restudy process, there are some projects that could be in a situation where they have no upgrades or very low cost and quick upgrades that they may be able to actually get a PPA with a load serving entity based on the information they have at that point and don't have to wait for their facility study. So our question to you as stakeholders is, would it be beneficial to have an option for projects that have a PPA before they receive their facility study report to seek an allocation? And in that case, it would only be for projects that have a PPA. We would not open the conditional allocation group. And then projects with a conditional allocation at their last retention opportunity that do not have a PPA will be withdrawn. And then projects that do not get an allocation in their last opportunity, to where they don't have anything to retain after their last opportunity to get an allocation and they don't get one, then those projects would have to withdraw at that time. In our prior proposal, we talked about allowing projects to switch to energy only. But as we continue to grapple with how the overall process works, one of the considerations is that since we study 150% of what's truly available from the transmission planning process for projects to be able to actually get an allocation of TPD, every year, at a minimum, 50% of the projects are not going to be able to get an allocation. And it could be more than that 50% if certain projects are turning out to be not viable and not getting a power purchase agreement, which means year after year, we could find a significant number of projects continuing to linger in the queue that really, after 3 opportunities, 3 years of marketing their projects, trying to get a PPA and being unsuccessful, will end up lingering in the queue. And we feel it's important at this point to basically require those projects to be withdrawn. This will prevent stalled projects from reserving reliability-related capacity and causing more viable projects to require costly and long lead time reliability network upgrades that will likely never be needed. And we're actually having Robert Sparks will be speaking later to a new policy that we're putting in place to try to deal with this situation. So it'll help that process. And it'll also facilitate the most viable projects to have shorter, earliest achievable in-service dates and to be able to market their project and be able to come online sooner. And next slide, please. Okay, why don't we go back to the prior slide? I think this is probably a good point to open it up for questions.
We have 3 hands in the queue. First hand is from Susan Schneider.
Oh, could we go back to the prior slide, please? Thank you.
Susan, go ahead. We're not getting any audio, Susan. Casey, can you hear me?
Me? Hello?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
we can hear you now.
We can hear you.
Yes, we
Okay,
can hear
sorry,
you.
I don't know what happened there. Okay, yeah, I have a few questions, not just on this slide, but in general, and hopefully they're mostly clarifications, and they'll go pretty quickly. There's a few references in the written document to things that are supposed to happen, like somebody seeking an allocation or having to comply with things in 2026. And I was a little puzzled by that, since it looks like you're not going to have an allocation in 2026. So should we read most of those to read 2027 when the next allocation would happen? For example, if somebody has a retention obligation for something they receive in 2025, can we assume that the compliance would be during the 2027 cycle?
Yes, I tried to correct that. Maybe we missed some of those, and rather than
There's just
talking
a few
about
in there.
2020,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, rather than talk
Okay.
about 2026, I tried to talk about the next allocation cycle following the 2025 cycle.
Okay. Yep. There's
And
still
just
a
to be
few in there.
clear,
So yeah.
okay, just to be clear about that, even though we've proposed to cancel or to not have an allocation cycle in the calendar year 2026 and have the next one in 2027, we decided not to cast that in stone at this point in time, because as we're developing this proposal, things could occur that we may change our mind on that. We're pretty firm on that, but we wanted to just leave that open so that, if something did come up to provide some indication that maybe we got to do something differently, we want to leave that open. But for the most part, we think it'll be 2025 and then followed by 2027.
It would be good to make that decision by the time the affidavits are due for 2025, so that people know when their compliance obligation, if there's a follow-up compliance obligation, when that would be due when they're making the request.
Oh, definitely. I think we'll be making that decision when we have the final proposal.
Okay.
We just want to make sure the final proposal, really confirms that's the right way to do things.
Okay, that's great. Now for cluster 14 projects, so if they don't have an allocation, it sounds like they can come in 2025 and request a group D allocation still. If they have an allocation, if they received one and they cannot retain it, can they also still come in and ask for a group D allocation in 2025?
I thought you were talking about an allocation in 2025. So
Okay, no, let's say they are, let's
uh,
say they had an allocation last year but they can't
okay.
retain it. So can they still
Oh,
come
I
in and
see.
ask
Yes.
for a new one?
Yes. That's, basically there's no changes to the allocation process for pre-cluster 15 projects. The
Okay,
only
all right.
real change is in 2027, if a project gets a Group D allocation in 2025, their next opportunity where they have to retain it by 2027, they have to have a PPA rather than being able to
Right.
go to the short list as an
Okay.
interim step. That's really the only change that's taken place.
Okay, I understand that. I appreciate your clarifying that because I didn't actually get that from the written proposal. So it's helpful to know that's what you're proposing. The if I guess I'm a little confused about it. Actually, it makes sense, and I appreciate you listening to the idea that the first opportunity of 3 for cluster 15 to request an allocation would be after the facility study's done. But then I think, and I think you've alluded to this. If it turns out that they normally wouldn't request that until after the facility study is done, as I recall, the facility study is scheduled to be done around it's in 2027, but scheduled to be done around April or May, and the affidavit due date is in March. So does that mean that they couldn't request if you leave the dates the same, it seems like they couldn't request an allocation until 2028.
Yeah, that is something that I think we're going to have to take a look at once we feel that we're getting to a point where we're solidifying this proposal. I think that's something we should actually look at and determine what is the appropriate date. So that's part of the reason we haven't really cast in stone the 2027 process because, it could, we don't want to have projects waiting too long to be able to seek an allocation. So we'll have to look at when the actual studies are completed for cluster 15 and what's the best cycle after that. Moving forward, we were really trying to tie the allocation process to when the transmission planning process takes its new projects to the board, which have been approved lately in May. Now, with the new FERC order 1920, there may be some changes in that. So we'll be looking at that and trying to determine what's the best timing for that and trying to accommodate as much as we can between the interconnection process and the transmission planning process.
Yeah, that makes sense because if you do it in March, then it would be relying on the TPP the year before. So okay, all right. So it makes sense to look at
Well,
it. Yeah,
actually, no.
what?
Just to be
Sorry.
clear on that, Susan, we did it in March, so we'd be getting the requests in March. We'd be validating them, and then the validation period would end after the board has approved the project, so that we could include that year's TPP projects.
Oh, okay. That's helpful. Thank you. That's helpful for clarification. So anyway, I wasn't questioning. I mean, it seems like a good idea to wait till after the facility studies the request, but then if they have to wait almost a year, like 10 months before they can even request a TPD allocation, it would be like a year before they would know if they got anything. So that was, yeah. So it sounds like you're thinking about that already, about coordinating those dates.
Right.
Okay. And then my last question is just to clarify, a project that finishes the facility study, they have to post, or after I guess it's after the first TPD allocation request. They have to, even if they don't get an allocation, they have to post their commercial readiness deposit, or they're up their commercial readiness deposit. But do they also have to execute a GIA at that time, or does the GIA execution wait until after they have tried their 3 tries, or how does the GIA execution fit into that?
The GIA execution does not change. It's how it's written in our FERC order compliance filing. So it's listed in the tariff how that plays out. And if I remember it correctly, the GIAs are required to be executed within something like 125 days after the facility studies are done.
Okay, so if they don't get an allocation, they still have to execute a GIA. That was really my question, just getting clarification on that.
That's correct. Yeah, they're totally uncoupled. to where, executing a GIA is not dependent on what happens in the allocation process.
Okay, well, it seems, and this is just to give some thought to this, but if the GIAs are executed before people find out if they have an allocation, if they don't get one that first time, and especially it sounds like if it's right after the facility study, they won't know in any case whether they've got one yet, and they have to execute a GIA, and then the third posting. Well, I guess the postings are totally different. So let me withdraw my question on that. So never mind. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your clarifications here, and I'll let somebody else have a turn. Thank you.
Okay, we have 7 more hands in the queue now, and our next hand is from Sanjay.
Good morning, Bob. Sonja Zhu from Collins on behalf of California Wind Energy Association. 2 questions. First one is for the parked cluster 14 project, because now the TPD allocation is postponed to September 2025. What happens to their second IFS posting? Will that be postponed accordingly?
One of the things that has been brought up, and the ISO will need to put it into our next proposal, is that with the pushback of the next allocation cycle to where it'll be more than 12 months between allocation cycles, we are going to have to stakeholders, should we allow or request FERC to have us postpone the second posting to more align with the TPD allocation process, so that projects wouldn't be in the mode of having to post 12 months after the last allocation process, which is significantly before the September 1st date of 2025. So that's something we'll be dealing with. But I think the ISO is leaning towards allowing that change, but it's something that we'll have to stakeholder and make sure everybody's in agreement with that change.
Okay, thank you. And second question is under the track 2, ISO prohibits energy a project initially requesting energy only from seeking TPD ever. So there's no opportunity to seek TPD and cannot transfer deliverability. So under this proposal, the second priority group, will that be open to those projects that initially requested energy only?
No, that tariff language will not change. And we'll get into that actually on the next slide into more details of which projects really will be eligible to seek an allocation to the commercial operation group.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Sanjay. Our next hand is from Soumya.
Hi, this is Soumya Shastri with PG&E. Can you just verify you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I had 3 clarifying questions. So the first is this stakeholder, the potential option to provide an opportunity to request during the facility study. Does that count as one of the 3 opportunities for that cluster, or is that that wouldn't be one of the 3?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because I was planning to mention that. And the answer is no, it would not count. That if someone sought an allocation during the facility study and was not able to get one, it would still have the 3 remaining opportunities along with all the other projects in its cluster group.
Okay, great. Thank you. The second question is, chatting with my team our team on the side here, we thought that I didn't follow what you and Susan were talking about, that cluster 15 wouldn't be ready till 2028. I'm looking at a calendar that says that the IFS would be ready in November of 26. So what is the challenge for 27 there that would push cluster 15 to 28? Can you just repeat that for me?
Yeah, I think as I was reflecting on our question, I was thinking about the schedule that we had for cluster 16 that we had posted. And I think you're right that the March date still does work for cluster 15, because it is on a different schedule than what the schedules will be for cluster 16 and beyond. So I think you're right that it will actually work out that March being the date that the request for new allocations would be due will still work out, but we'll confirm that.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question is actually, maybe you can address it when you get to slide 13. I'll just ask it now since I have the mic. The off-taker, the category, the PPA group, the category where it says off-taker is procuring the capacity to meet its own RA obligation. Can you clarify that if when you get to that slide, can you discuss that might also include LSEs owning assets? So I'll just leave that there now, so to not enter the queue, but I understand you can talk about it on 13.
Okay, well, it's an easy one. I can answer that, yes. You know, since an LSE that has RA obligations, if it's building the project themselves, it still will count for that category.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Samia. Our next hand is from Aisha.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
hi
we can hear
Bob,
you.
good morning. Just was struggling with my mute button here. Bob, I had a question on this slide. So I understand the first opportunity is, right after your facility study. I'm a little confused on the second and the third opportunity. Like, how do you become eligible for that? Or do you need to show a PPA execution for the second or the third opportunity, or you just keep requesting allocation subsequently? Like, you didn't get the deliverability in the first opportunity, so you say, hey, I requested it in the previous cycle, I didn't get it, so I want my second opportunity to get used now, and my third opportunity to get used if I don't get it. Like, could you clarify that? Because I was reading the proposal.
Yeah.
It was not very clear. Maybe it was just me, or maybe I didn't pay attention earlier, but it'll be very helpful to get some clarity on that, how to get eligible for the second and the third round.
And it was perfectly clear in my mind, but I can understand it may not be in others. So the way it works is every project will have 3 opportunities to seek an allocation. If it has a PPA and gets an allocation, then it's done. But projects that don't get a PPA will have basically 3 years to market their project. So in the first year, a project gets an allocation under the conditional group. And then the next allocation year, if it's not able to retain that allocation by demonstrating it has an eligible PPA, then it loses that allocation. But it can, that same year then, reseek another allocation under the conditional allocation group. And then it has another year to market its project. It knows it has an allocation for that year, but only for that year. And if it signs a PPA before that particular cycle is done, it can keep that allocation. But if it doesn't get a PPA, again, it will lose its allocation and will have to reseek another conditional allocation in the third year. And if it receives an allocation that year, then it can market their project again, but have to retain it. And the project, since we study 150% of the actual available TPD, not all projects will be able to get an allocation to the conditional allocation group. Well, assuming we get so many projects that we are up to the 150% at HPOI. So we'll be using the scoring process to determine which ones will be able to get an allocation, or at least a priority to give out the allocation in the conditional group.
And the ones that don't get the allocation in the first year, do they convert to energy only and
no, they can seek it the next year.
Okay, they can.
They can seek it the next year. Yeah, so basically projects can hang out in the queue for 3 years, trying to get an allocation, trying to market their project for that 3-year period. Regardless of whether they get an allocation or not, they have those 3 opportunities, those 3 years to market their project. And then after that last opportunity is used up and project no longer has a retention possibility, at that point is when they'd be withdrawn.
Got it. That's super helpful, Bob. Thank you. One question follow up to what PG&E raised, and you clarified how what like I'm a little confused. If a project has not received a facility study and they do request allocation, which could be a cluster 16 project maybe for the first time of implementation of this, uh, like why does that round not count? Is there a reason behind it? I was curious, like why was this like this sounds to me that project could potentially get 4 rounds, so it's kind of like an exception, but I was curious like what helps the project not get counted for those 3 rounds.
I think the main reason is simplicity. Rather than us having to track projects and say, okay, this project got an allocation during the facility study. So it has now began its 3 opportunity process, and it's on a different path than the majority of the projects in this cluster. So we have to track that and make sure that we don't allow it to get to seek an allocation when everybody else is in their 3rd allocation, and for it, it's the 4th. So I think for us, it's really been just simplicity of the process to do it that way. We thought about, is there some way that we want to kind of raise the level of commitment that a project that might seek an allocation during the facility study to where that does actually trigger their 3 years. If, within stakeholder in your comments, if you think that's really the more appropriate way to go, we can entertain that. So, we're not locked into that particular thing. So really related to this particular option, it's not part of the proposal now. If we get enough stakeholder support to include this as a potential, as an opportunity for projects seeking allocation during the facility study, give us comments on that and tell us what you think about it. Should that start your 3 years or not?
Sounds good. We'll do that. Thank you, Bob. That's all I had.
Situation. Our next hand is from Dinesh.
Good morning, Bob. My question is on slide 9.
Dinesh, your volume is coming in really quiet, and can you please say your name and affiliation?
Hi, can you hear me okay now? Is it better?
Much better. Thank
A
you.
little better.
Okay. Good morning, Bob. This is Dinesh Salem Natarajan with EAS Energy Consulting. Bob, my question for you is on slide 9. Can you flip back to slide 9? Okay. Now, in a way, are these 3 priority groups indicative also of the priority between the groups? Like, is PPA group priority 1 and commercial operations group priority 2, and then the conditional is priority 3?
Well, within each of these 3 groups, the priority will be based on scoring, which will be covered a little bit later in the presentation. So, so the order in which we allocate to the first group, those have PPAs. We'll be looking at the scoring criteria too, and we'll be doing allocation within each of these groups based on the highest scoring projects. We'll get the first opportunity to get an allocation, then we'll go down the list to the lower scoring process. So does that answer your question?
So I think it does, Bob. Just for clarity, so let's say you have 3 projects under the PPA group. They all may have different scoring, but so long as the capacity is available, all 3 projects would get the allocation. And only then will you start looking at projects in the commercial operation group, correct?
Okay, yeah, now I better understand your question. Yes, that is correct. So the first priority is to the projects with a PPA. If there's capacity left over for the next group, then we'll go ahead and look at that group. But if it turns out that the first group utilized all of the TPD that's available at the POI at a project in the second group was seeking an allocation in, then it's not going to be able to get an allocation.
Okay, but let's say, in this particular discussion, maybe the PPA group projects have obtained all have been allotted all the capacity that is available. However, their CODs are a couple of years or few years away. In that sense, or in that situation, would the commercial operation group get interim deliverability? Because these are projects that are already online, right?
That would be something that the interim deliverability process would have to speak to. And, I think I'd probably be safest just to say, if you could hold that question to Robert Sparks when he talks about the interim deliverability process, we actually have a proposal based on that.
Okay.
I think that would be best.
Okay. And then the last question I have is that when I read, under your second priority group, the commercial operation, I see that you say eligible energy-only projects. So does it mean that there is a category of energy-only projects that have achieved commercial operation? Is there an additional qualification needed for that?
Yes, and we'll go into that somewhat on the next slide that we'll get to.
Okay.
To the simple answer is that under our new Track 2 process, projects that enter the queue as energy only will never be able to get an allocation, even if they come online.
Okay. Okay, but you're going to.
And we'll get into more of the nuances with that later on.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. All right. That's all I have.
And just to one thing I wanted to mention related to this PPA allocation group process is we really feel that this process really puts the allocation of transmission plan deliverability into the hands of the market, and the market being the load serving entities and the non-load serving entities that are seeking to contract with projects on a long-term basis. And so it really gives them the opportunity to look at the projects, know which projects actually have an allocation now, and choose the projects they think are best suited. And issues such as, later in-service dates and those type of things, those kind of decisions are really within the hands of the procurement side of the process to determine if they want to procure those, projects with maybe longer lead time upgrades or not. So someone could get a PPA and have a commercial operation date that's a number of years out. But if they choose that project is best suited for their procurement needs, that's the way the process will play out. It'll be up to the market to determine which are truly the best projects to move forward. So let's move to the next question.
Well, thanks, Dinesh. Our next hand is from Jasmine.
Hi, Bob. This is Jasmine from AES. My question is related to the 3 strikes and your withdrawn policy, updated policy. During the working group, we talked about how it's a little bit difficult for projects to get a PPA if you're kind of waiting for these delays, DNUs and RNUs. I guess with this updated proposal, like what solution do you have to this issue?
Frankly, we had those working group meetings. We threw out some ideas related to how procurement could take place for long lead time DNUs and long lead time RNUs. And what the ISO had kind of floated out there as potential solutions was pretty much rejected by everybody. And we didn't really receive anything that we thought was a firm proposal that we could use in its place. It was recognized by a number of stakeholders that some of the issues that we're dealing with are really outside of the realm of the ISO to be able to handle within the allocation process, that we really need to do some additional work outside of Track 3 to find solutions to those particular issues. So at this point in time, we don't have a solution that we think is really workable within the TPD allocation process for those type of circumstances. But we are committed to continue to work on them and seek to find solutions for those, but just not within Track 3 at this point. Yeah, other than I will mention, we do have a proposal for the long lead time resources that we think that we do have a way to be able to handle those within this process.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
And again, part of it is the market will determine which projects really are viable. And if someone sees a project with long lead time upgrades but says, that's a project that is of value to my organizations, they can always procure that. So it's really going to be the market that makes those determinations. The next question, please.
This is Danielle. I just wanted to add briefly to that response, Bob. I agree with you, and we did think a lot about the conversations that we had in the working group. Like Bob said, I think a lot of this does extend beyond the ISO's TPD allocation process. So we'll continue to pay attention to some of those issues of longer lead time or delayed network upgrades in the Transmission Development Forum. And we're also talking to the PUC and other state entities about, making sure that procurement is sort of keeping pace with some of the deliverability and interconnection issues. So those are ongoing discussions that are happening sort of in a related fashion, but peripherally to this initiative.
Yes, thanks, Danielle.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. So there was one question in the chat from David Corzilius from PG&E. How will these TPD changes impact distribution projects seeking deliverability allocations? At a minimum, it appears these revisions eliminate the DGD process. Is this correct? Can distribution projects still seek deliverability through the CAISO FCDS study, cluster study process?
Yeah, this does not change anything for the WDAP projects seeking deliverability. So we will still study the WDAP projects. We have, set out the criteria for the way WDAP projects can be studied within our tariff as it stands now. So this doesn't really change anything for WDAP projects. And while we have contemplated what do we do with the DGD, the Distributed Energy Resource Deliverability process, primarily because it's driven off the CPUC portfolio of what they would like to see as additional capacity in the distribution side of the system. We haven't seen them increase the amount in their portfolios for that. So the DGD process hasn't had a lot of capacity available to it. But at this point, we actually thought about bringing that into Track 3, but we felt, this is probably not the right time to do that. So at this point in time, the DGD process is not changing.
We have 4 more hands raised in the queue. Our next hand is from Eddie.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Bob. Eddie Didashli from Pars Energy. I have a question and more like confirmation of my understanding on park projects. If you have a cluster 14 project that's currently parked, and let's say it's been parked for 6 months, it would not be allowed to go through the 1-year course of being parked, and it has to post commercial readiness deposit and their second financial security by the dates that has been identified in CAISO's for the 2023 compliance filing, and has to enter GIA negotiations immediately after. Is that correct?
Actually, no, that is not correct. The pre-cluster 15 projects are still governed by Appendix DD, the GIDAP tariff. And so the new proposed changes under the FERC Order 2023 are part of Appendix KK, which really impact cluster 15 and beyond. So there is a demarcation for projects between cluster 14 and cluster 15, where cluster 14 and prior are under the process in Appendix DD, and 15 forward are under Appendix KK. So there's no changes to when projects have to go into execute their GIA, and projects are still required to make their third interconnection for national security posting for clusters 14 and earlier.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Eddie. Our next hand is from Kaushal.
Hey, Bob, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, this is Kaushal from Amber Renewables. So if there's a project in WD with PPA, which was a cluster 14 project, and for some reason the project missed the TPD study in 2024, and that project was expecting to participate in 2025 TPD study, which is now looks like being replaced by 2026. How can that project attain TPD so that they can meet their COD, which could be earlier than that 2026 TPD timeline? I mean, this
So
project
you're
has
saying a project, it has been, well, you say it missed cluster 14, so it's trying to be studied in cluster 15?
No, the study FCDS is finished in cluster 14, but it was preparing to submit for TPD study allocation, so it missed the 2024 TPD study.
Oh, it
so
missed
now
the TPD request window. So,
yeah,
so the
window
next
and affidavit
request window is going to be September of 2025. And
yeah,
so
but
all
we were
projects
hoping
have to
that
wait.
will be but so is there any process where that project can get TPD so that, because it's going to miss the COD would be earlier than 2026 timeline. So in such cases, they would have to delay the COD. Is there any way those projects can accelerate the TPD in a separate study process or something for only specifically those projects? It's a distribution level for the project.
Right. I guess I'd again have to defer to Robert. I'm not sure if a project in that particular circumstance is eligible for an interim deliverability, but at best, that's what it would be able to get would be interim deliverability. But I'm not sure if that kind of a project actually qualifies, so I'd have to defer to Robert. So why don't you hold your question until Robert does his presentation on the very last item on the agenda here.
All right. Thank you, Bob.
Daniel, do you have your hand up as well?
Oh, sorry, that's
all. Thank you, Kaushal. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kaushal, for your question. Our next hand is from Vinny.
Hey, Bob. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. On this slide, I was trying to understand, rather compare this third priority group with group D that exists today.
Okay.
I think the only difference that I'm seeing is in terms of retention. This group third priority is not allowed to show shortlist. It has to have PPA for retention the next year. But apart from that, do you see any difference between this group and existing group D as such?
Yeah, the main difference is the current allocation group D has restrictions that once you apply in group D, then you are under restrictions where you cannot change your COD unless you have some PTO delay to your COD. And there's restrictions related to providing your notice to proceed and those type of things. Those restrictions will not apply to the conditional group. So what that really means is in the past, not everybody was willing to put their project under those restrictions, so they did not apply under group D. Under this new allocation group, there'll be no reason that a project wouldn't want to be included in the conditional allocation group. So we'll be assuming everybody will be applying for that group, and we'll just be speaking from projects, give us your scoring information so we can determine the order to allocate to that group. And if someone chooses not to give us any scoring, we'll just assume their scoring is 0 and we'll include them in the process. So what this does is it provides everybody, an opportunity to go out there, at least the greatest amount of project capacity to go out there and start marketing their project as soon as the studies are done and the TPD allocation study is done. So it really will help both the developers as well as the load serving entities will have really the largest possible slate to consider for the procurement process that they have going on at that time.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I don't know if you covered slide 12 already, but I had a question on additions. Like MMA or post COD. I get that
Yeah,
they
let's
are
hold
added
those
as.
off until
Oh, you
we
haven't?
cover those slides.
Okay, sounds
No,
good.
not
Thank
yet.
you.
Our next hand is from Shukul. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, Bob. I had a kind of more of a clarification type question. I mean, as you mentioned, all pre-cluster 15 projects have 2 more chances at a TPD allocation, but the parking opportunity is gone. Does it mean that all these
Let me, do you mind if I just clarify that?
Yeah.
So projects in cluster 14 have exercised, those that needed to exercise their first opportunity to park. Okay. So in the 2025 allocation process, those projects that have parked will be able to seek an allocation again in all of the A, B, C, and D allocation groups. However,
Yes.
if they don't receive an allocation in 2025, they would be required to meet the requirements to park a second year. And those requirements are, the main one is there has to actually be TPD available at your POI in order to be able to park. You know, it's kind of one of those obvious things. If there's nothing to be allocated out in the future, then why allow a project to park to seek it when we already know there's nothing available? The other part of the requirement is if they're in a group that has a commonly shared network upgrade, all projects that share that network upgrade have to request to park. And if one project doesn't request to park, it wants to move forward, then the other project sharing that upgrade can't park because they're all going to need to fund that upgrade that is being shared. So for cluster 14, there weren't any projects, just by the sheer size of cluster 14, there was no available TPD left over, so no projects could park a second time. Or excuse me, that was cluster 13. It may play out for cluster 14 as well. That's yet to be seen. So hopefully that helps inform a bit of your question.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, like, if next year have a chance, and if we do not get any allocation, and that depends on. So would this POI be even studied if there's no TPD available at next year, as per that spreadsheet that we have?
Cluster 14 have already been studied. So yes. It's not an issue for cluster 14. The new process moving forward is, can you get in to be studied in the first place if there's nothing available? We have a new process related to that, with the merchant process and those type of things. So it is a different process moving forward. But for cluster 14 and earlier projects, the process pretty much remains the same.
Okay, and if we do not park, that means that we have to make that IFS2 posting and possibly also execute an LGIA with the participating TO, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
I'm curious how many more questions we have lined up, because we do have some more. What's that?
That was the last question. We've made it through all the questions.
Oh, that's all of them. Okay, great. Because I was getting nervous that I'm going to use up other people's time. So why don't we move on to, I believe, slide 12. Okay. So this deals with allocations for the modification process, to where projects either seeking an MMA for projects that are still active in the queue, or projects that are in COD and seeking to modify their projects. So any technology additions will be added as energy only and may only be able to seek TPD through the commercial operation group. So this will begin to take, well, let me just go through the slide. I think that's probably stated later. Only projects eligible to seek an allocation which are those projects that were studied as FCDS or merchant, have this option. So energy-only projects are ineligible to seek an allocation, even if through the technology addition. So basically, you know, since the tariff says that if you're an energy-only project from day one that you seek your or you submit your interconnection request for an energy-only project, you're not able to get deliverability for that project ever. It basically locks you out. You've requested energy only and you have to stay energy only. So we didn't want projects to try to short circuit that process, saying, well, I didn't want to have to go through the scoring for deliverability, so or I wasn't able to be studied, so I'm going to try to do something through the MMA process and add it to an existing project in a queue. We didn't want projects to be able to short circuit that process. So the projects that are adding technology to it that later want to seek deliverability can only do so if their original project that they're adding to was studied as FCDS. And this will commence after the 2025 TPD allocation cycle request window. So projects that are in the works with an MMA now, as long as the MMA is approved by the time the allocation window closes in September, those projects can go ahead and still seek FCDS through the commercial option, even if it's an energy-only project. But after the 2025 TPD allocation cycle, these requirements will take place. And energy-only projects in clusters prior to cluster 15 will have one additional opportunity during the 2025 TPD allocation cycle to seek an allocation through the existing GitApp allocation groups A through C, which are the PPA group, the shortlist group, and the commercial operation group. They won't be able to seek through the group D allocation. So allocation group B, the shortlist group, is continued up and through the 2025 allocation cycle, but after 2025, the shortlist group goes away. So I imagine there'll be some questions on this, so why don't we open it up for questions? And since Jason Foster is the one that runs the modification process, he may be chiming in on some of the answers that are, or questions that are asked.
Okay, we have 4 hands in the queue. Our first hand is from Jasmine.
Hey Bob, I'm Jasmine from AES again. Just the clarifying questions. With this, in terms of deliverability transfers, for example, if there's a storage project that was added to like a solar project through an MMA, can we transfer deliverability that way to a different project, or does that storage project in this example would have to stay as energy only?
I'll let Jason answer that one since he dealt with that, I believe, in track 2 to some extent.
Hey, Jasmine, I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so can deliverability be transferred to a project that was added through the MMA process?
So for cluster 14 and earlier, we would allow that. For cluster 15 and later, if the project is studied as FCDS or as merchant and adds a battery storage, then there could potentially be a transfer to that battery storage.
Okay, so transfers are still allowed within the same queue position.
So if you're, okay, yeah, so within the same queue position, if you're talking about, I'm just going to run by way of example here, right? If you have a 100 megawatt solar facility and it's studied as FCDS, and you then later submit a modification to add battery storage to that and want to transfer the deliverability from solar to battery within the same queue position, that is permitted, yes. There's no, when we talk about transfers, we talk about project to project transfers at the same point of interconnection and voltage level. Okay. That's primarily the transfers we'll refer to. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, good
that's
clarification.
helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine, for your question. Our next hand is from Susan.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me okay this time?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think it would be best in the next version if you could clarify the intra-project transfers with the inter-project transfers. So I guess this idea that an energy-only project couldn't seek an allocation even for additions, even if they already build them, that was not quite clear in the proposal. So if a project, I don't want to get too esoteric, but if a project did seek deliverability and received it, I guess, because otherwise they would have to leave the queue, and then they put in an MMA request to have a technology addition, could they still transfer deliverability from another project to that technology addition?
Susan, it's Jason. So under the track 2 transfer policy, I believe that would be allowed, but the transfer ring project must withdraw from the queue.
Right. Now, or
So,
unless they have a PPA for energy only at the time.
Well, let me clarify this, right? So we need to be very specific here. In cluster 14 and earlier, the energy only projects will have an additional opportunity to seek an allocation in 2025. After that, they will not, right? So once those projects become energy only, cluster 14 and earlier, maybe this is something we need to take back into the next paper. We'll consider this, but would transfers be allowed to energy only projects to then make them deliverable?
Okay, that wasn't actually my question, but that is one question. Again, it's not really clear with the inter versus intra.
Sure. So then cluster 15 going forward, right? The energy only projects we're referring to, excuse me, hold on one second. The energy only projects that we're referring to are those that enter the queue as energy only, right?
Right. And that wasn't really my question.
Okay, then I'm missing something. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize if I wasn't clear. But my question was a project that was studied for deliverability and received an allocation. Okay, so they came in either as merchant or as FCDS, and they have a technology addition for storage. My question was, could they transfer deliverability from another project to that energy only technology addition?
According to what we wrote, is that any project, any technology additions is what we're calling it. So in your example, best addition would not be eligible to seek an allocation, right? So the question then is transfers to, and I suppose the answer would be yes, so long as the transferring project withdraws from the queue to maintain the viability of whatever project is proceeding forward.
Now let me ask a question. So right today, if a project transfers deliverability based on what I thought was already filed, and I know that was pre-cluster 15, but if a project transfers its deliverability, it either has to downsize or produce an energy only PPA at that time to stay in, right? I thought that was allowed. But you have to have that at the time of the request in order to keep the capacity in the queue.
Yeah, I don't want to confirm that right now, Susan. I'd have to go back and look at what we wrote in the tariff. It may be true, and if we did write that, and if the transferring project had an energy only PPA, then
I think that's
the answer
exactly
is yes,
right.
Okay, that's what we wrote. Yeah,
that's what you wrote. Go ahead and confirm it, but in the future for cluster 15 in the proposal here, would that still be allowed? And then would the energy only capacity then still be able to stay in the queue if it could show you an energy only PPA, or does it have to withdraw? I mean, it'd be good to. Anyway, let me just leave the question as that.
I think the answer is yes. If projects have PPAs, that's what we're trying to shoot for here, right? And as long as they're proceeding forward to their construction and maintaining achievable milestones, that's what we're looking for.
Okay, so all right, so
go ahead. And I'll clarify that if I'm understanding it correctly, we're only talking about cluster 14 and earlier projects.
Okay, well, my latest question was cluster 15. Yeah, cluster 14 and earlier, you produce the PPA, you get to stay in the queue and you can transfer, and then the technology edition could get the deliverability. My question is, are you changing that here? So if the project was studied for FCDS, they add a technology edition that is at that time energy only. Can another project transfer the deliverability to that technology edition but remain in the queue if they have an energy only PPA?
Okay.
So this is Bob.
I'm gonna
I
say
think the
no.
best way to. So
Are you
why
looking to
don't we
change
just
the
say
rules or
this?
keep them?
Yeah, Susan, if you would ask that as a clarifying question in your comments, we'll make sure we address it in the next paper because it hasn't been addressed in this paper. So rather than try to address it on the fly, give us a time to take a look at it through the comments, and we'll make sure we address it in the next paper.
Okay, yeah, and I think in general, the next paper, if it could have just a little more discussion about TPD transfers pre-cluster 15 and cluster 15 going forward, the technology additions, all of that just really needs a little more, I think, a little more clarification here. And then so I appreciate your offering to do that because it definitely is needed. I guess my more general question here is there's a bit of a discussion about, well, we allowed these technology transfers because we had this urgent need, but now we don't have the need and we think it's just queue jumping. And so it sounds like the CAISO is sort of turned, for lack of, I don't want to mean to exaggerate, but it sounds like the CAISO is sort of turned against these technology additions and feel like it's somehow people trying to get around the rules. At the same time, the slice of day really prizes these mixed fuel resources and additions like that under those rules. Can you sort of give your thoughts about, is this a real change of direction by the CAISO, and how does that fit in with the slice of day values?
Well, this is Bob. I can't really speak necessarily so much to the slice of day values. Maybe Danielle can, but it is somewhat of a change of direction. Yes, we originally put this in place in order to encourage storage projects and other technologies to that really were technologies and capacity that the ISO really needed in order to meet system needs. And we needed it quickly. They weren't in the queue at the time. So we wanted to provide an opportunity for those projects to actually get into the process and come online quickly to serve those needs. If you look at the cluster, the queue right now, there is no shortage of storage projects anymore. And so, lots of projects are competing as storage to, we've got 10,000 megawatts online now of storage. So, it's been very successful having this process, but we don't see that particular need through that mechanism is still required. Not to say that there aren't some cases that it would be beneficial to allow it under certain conditions. So we aren't taking it away, but we think there is an issue where projects could actually, jump ahead of other projects. I can envision a scenario where a project is trying to compete as a specific type of project and finds that I'm not able to get a PPA, so I need to modify my project, and it's going to modify a project that's been in the queue for some time that allows it to jump ahead of another project that understood the market ahead of this other project and submitted an interconnection request that really that project should have first priority for this capacity because it submitted a project from day one as an interconnection request to meet a specific need, and other projects that recognize that need later shouldn't jump ahead of that project. So that's some of our thinking behind this.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it. That's all the questions I had for now.
Thank you, Susan, for your questions. We have 4 more hands in the queue. Our next hand is from Aftab.
Hi, Bob and Jason. This is Aftab from SP Energy. I just wanted to get a clarification on the portion of the slide where it says have this option. So let's say we have projects entering cluster 15 as an energy only BESS project. Would they be allowed to add solar component later? So sort of the reverse.
And it would be added as, well, in
Through
this
an
case,
MMA.
it could be added to a FCDS project, and it could seek an allocation to the commercial operation group.
Right. But let's say a project is entering cluster 15 as an energy only. So energy only project, just an energy only BESS project. And would it be allowed to add solar later through MMM?
No. In that case, it's an energy only project, and it's not eligible to seek an allocation for technology addition.
Right. But would it be allowed to add the solar even though it's not seeking an allocation?
Oh, we can add solar, yes.
Okay.
We aren't getting rid of the technology addition process. We're just kind of defining what projects can actually get an allocation and through what allocation group that are added to the technology addition process.
Got it. That helps. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Tim, for your question. Our next hand is from Max.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for the presentation. This is Max Code with Pattern Energy. I just want to clarify, because I think you said it at the beginning of the explanation of this slide, but it's not written, that this restriction is only for energy-only projects and that it's basically not applicable for an FCDS project, meaning that if you have an existing FCDS project or one that's in the queue and you want to add a modification to it, that can seek TPD through the other groups.
No, it can only seek an allocation to the commercial operation group.
Okay, so it's...
So again, the reasoning here is we think the first priority should go to projects that design their project initially the way that they want it. Let those projects have the first opportunity to get an allocation. The next allocation group after that would be the commercial operation group, and that would be the group that projects that are adding capacity to the technology addition would have to go in order to seek an allocation.
Okay. I mean, what I'm thinking about, just for context, is like optimization of existing interconnection service capacity. And if you had an existing resource that's not, fully optimizing to the extent possible, you're not really going to be able to expand those projects. Yeah, I'll think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they wouldn't be able to, but they have to make more, obviously it's a higher commitment in order to get an allocation to the commercial operation allocation group.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Max. We have one last hand from Derek.
Thanks. Bob, this is Derek Hageman, excuse me, with Gable Associates. Two quick questions. The first, can you just clarify if a pre-cluster 15 project that converts to energy only after the 2025 allocation, will they be able to seek an allocation through the commercial operation allocation group?
For sure, the answer is no.
Okay, so the 2025 allocation will be the last, because in the previous slide it specified the PPA and the shortlist group, but there will be no allocation group that they'd be eligible for. Okay. And then my second question for additions to an FCDS project, will there be a limit to the sort of allocation cycles that addition can attempt to receive allocations? Like, does that 3 consecutive TP allocation cycles apply to the addition as well?
No. So in this case, seeking an allocation for technology addition would be through the commercial operation group. So it can do that at any time, but it has to meet that threshold of it's in commercial operation. So anytime a project goes in that commercial operation, then it can seek an allocation. It can't kind of reinsert itself by doing an addition and go through the 3 allocation process.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Derek. And we just had one more hand raised. Let's go to Vineet.
Hey Bob, this is Vinny from Clearway. I think the response to that last question kind of confused me. So let's say a cluster 14 project, it goes for next allocation, doesn't receive allocation, and is forced to convert to energy only. It can still keep on seeking TPD allocations in subsequent cycle only if it reaches COD, right? Is that correct?
Okay, so, and let's see, can we go to a prior slide? Can we go to slide 11? I'm trying to remember where this speaks to this, but, you know, having, I thought I had it all down. In this case, I think the answer is no. So I'll have to confirm that, that once the project is energy only, after the 2025 allocation cycle, it can no longer seek an allocation through allocation, the commercial allocation group.
Okay, yeah, that would be helpful because my understanding was commercial operation group was always open for energy only.
No.
That was one.
Yeah, it's only open to eligible projects. And at this point in time, the only eligible projects to seek an allocation to the commercial allocation group are those technology additions that are eligible to seek that. So we're basically closing the door for energy-only projects who are, you know, essentially lingering in the queue to linger in the queue and try to seek an allocation at some point in time as FCDS. The only way they can come online is energy only.
Okay. I see. Yeah, we'll put some comments there. So let's say, and this was for cluster 14 and earlier. Now moving to cluster 15, projects that enter as energy only. I know they cannot request for TPD allocation, but let's say that project achieves commercial operation in cluster 15. Is that eligible for TPD, seeking TPD?
No. Yeah, that's already in the tariff.
Even after commercial operation?
That's correct. Projects that came in energy only cannot seek an allocation. We actually put in the proposal the tariff language that's in the tariff that has been approved by FERC that states that projects that come into the cluster study process as energy only will always be energy only.
Okay, all right. And on slide 12, let's say a project adds a technology, let's say BESS addition to an existing queue position. That BESS addition is considered or added as energy only. I think I get that part. In terms of transfer restriction, this slide is not talking about any transfer restrictions, right? This is only a new TPD allocation seeking for that added energy only. The transfer restriction are completely separate and in that track 2 proposal.
That's correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Vineet, for your questions. Do you have more time? We have 3 more hands. Bob, how are you doing on time?
Well, we are running short on time now, and I don't want to take too much of Danielle's time. So if we can just ask those folks that still have questions to ask those questions in their comments. We still have some more items on this particular proposal to go through. So if we could just move on, I think that's best at this point in time. So if we could move to slide 13. So this is the table that is a modification of the table that we have in the the GitF tariff BPM. We have a current table similar to this, and this table is modified of what we would include in the BPM for Appendix KK. So to go through these changes, this is the scoring process that we use within each of the allocation groups to determine the priority that we would determine if there's available capacity for the various projects. So the highest scoring project would be considered first, and then going down to the next level. So the next lower scoring project, it would be considered second, and so forth. So within this table, the permitting process on the left is the existing process. That has not changed. So we're keeping that as is. Under the purchase power agreement status, we have made changes to that based on stakeholder comments. So in this case, the minimum requirement is having an executed PPA, so that doesn't get any points. That just qualifies you to be in the PPA allocation group. And the only points that we would give in this case would be for projects that are actually procuring a project for RA, which is actually a requirement of the PPA, but that the off-taker actually has an RA obligation. So we want to make sure that the capacity that is built in order to support the resource adequacy program, that the projects that actually have a resource adequacy obligation are the projects that have first priority to get an allocation to the PPA group. And then moving over to the GIA status column, this was proposed in the last cycle, the last paper. We had kind of proposed it as a separate table, and we had another item related to projects that are expanding an existing project or project that's in construction, that expansion consideration. We got enough stakeholder feedback on that we decided to remove that option, that scoring category. So we just moved. We felt it was probably best just to move this GIA status into this table. So these particular items under the GIA status have not changed. They're just moved into this particular table. So this is what we're suggesting for the scoring. Knowing how important TPD is, we know we need to have as robust a scoring process as possible. We've kind of debated what could be in and out of this, both in this process as well as within the cluster intake process. What are viable criteria to actually provide scoring? So it's a very difficult thing to be able to come up with really good criteria to score based on that is truly what I might say is black and white. It's easy for us to validate. It doesn't give any type of project some type of advantage that's not appropriate in those type of concerns. So this is the table as it stands now. We're still open for additional items, but first of all, they have to be appropriate, and they also have to be something that we can validate, and it has to be have scoring that is distinguishable. We don't want to have a process to where we have another category to add, but then it's so easy for everybody just to get the top score that it really becomes meaningless. So it has to have some true differentiation between the various points within a new category. So keep that in mind if you have some ideas for additional category. Why don't we move to the next slide? And then for the commercial operation group, we don't expect to see a lot of these every single year, that we need a very robust scoring mechanism for those projects. Obviously, the permitting process is already behind it for these projects, so you can't use that. We can use the PPA process, where projects that actually have an RA contract would be given top priority. And then related to the GIA process, those projects are in commercial operation. So, so that doesn't fit for them either. So the second item would be the distribution factor. And we're thinking that this is probably enough for this category. We had in the prior proposal an item that we would also have based off of the commercial operation date of the project. We got some pushback from stakeholders on that. And to some extent, I think that pushback was legitimate. And so, so we took that out of the proposal. But if anybody has any additional items they think would be appropriate for this, again, knowing that we probably every year won't have a lot of competition at a single POI, which these projects are going to be competing at based on the available capacity at the POI. We probably won't have a lot of competition between projects. So I think this is probably enough. But if you think something else is needed, feel free to propose that. Let's open it up for questions on this one. I think this one's worth discussing a little bit further if there are clarifying questions.
Okay. We have 3 hands in the queue. Let's go to Michael first.
Hi,
and if we could go back to the prior slide. Yes.
Great. Thanks for the presentation and taking my question. So I just had a clarifying question on the PPA.
Sorry, Michael, can you say your name and affiliation just for everybody?
Yeah, Michael Freeman, SCE. So on the PPA group, the points, the off-taker is procuring capacity to meet its own RA obligation. I was just curious about LSE-owned projects that may not have a PPA. So I guess it's kind of twofold. One, would that be the 5-point category? And then also, if it doesn't have a formal PPA, but it's owned by the LSE, does that also fall within the PPA group?
Yes, for an entity that's building its own project, that project's going to have to be approved by its local regulatory authority. So in essence, that is equivalent to a PPA. So, so a load-serving entity that's building its project on its own, but it's doing so to meet an RA obligation, we would just need you to attest to that rather than providing a PPA in that case. So yes, it would account for the 5 points.
Great, thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Michael. Our next hand is from Salmia.
Hi, thanks, Salmia Shasta with PG&E. Actually, if you don't mind going back to the previous slide that was showing, it could be the next slide. So to circle back on what is eligible for the commercial operation group, I think I'm confused. So in cluster 15 and beyond, if you enter the queue as EO, then you're never eligible to get deliverability. So you're not eligible for the commercial operation group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then if you're in the TPD group, the proposal now is that you have 3 chances to get TPD, and then after those 3 chances, you have to withdraw.
Correct.
So then is this commercial operation group just for cluster 14 and earlier? Because at least that seems really like an all for, oh, go ahead.
It's really for the process for the technology additions, that those projects can, under the appropriate circumstances, can seek an allocation to this group. That's really the group that this has been retained for.
Okay. I think it'd be great if you could clarify that. I didn't understand that.
Okay.
In the next
if you could add that to your comments, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, we will. We will. Thanks.
Thank you, Samia. Our next hand is from Aisha.
Hello. Hey, Bob.
I have a question on the previous slide, but what question I have, that content is not shown. So the previous slide where, yeah, beneath this table in the proposal, the tiebreaker for conditional group is the project that has earliest achievable in service date. And I wanted to ask, like, what was the rationale to choose that over the defects, or like over the defects, because we were, like, earliest achievable in service dates are really not under the control of developers. It cannot be an indicator of your commercial viability, because they are driven by, oftentimes, most of the times, by RNU schedules that are provided by PTOs. And sometimes, these schedules get delayed because of reprioritization and whatnot. So I was curious if that is the most optimal way to break the tie, and like if there is room to have a better or more fairer mechanism to break the tie for the conditional group. Like, we'd be happy to add our comments there, but yeah, I guess like it will be just good to know where is the in-service date coming from right now, and if KAISO has other mechanisms in mind that could potentially act as alternates for that tiebreaker mechanism.
So frankly, I'm not remembering what you're referring to as a tiebreaker based on COD. You're saying it's in a footnote?
It's on page 22 of the proposal. Right beneath this table, there is a section called tiebreaker, and it says the project's earliest achievable in service date will be used as a tiebreaker between projects with equal scores, with the earliest achievable in service date getting a higher ranking. And we can, yeah, it's on page number 22 of the proposal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, provide your comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to provide comments. We'd really love to hear any other alternates that KAISO might have in subsequent versions. Yeah, just wanted to make a note. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. We have one more hand in the queue, Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. For the LSE owned resources, Bob, you sort of said that they had to be approved by the local regulatory authority, or do they not have to be approved, or is it just an attestation? I guess I was a little unclear about what for the self builds, what is actually required for that.
We haven't actually developed any specific, criteria or related to that. So it may be something that we need to do at this point. So if you would like to see that added, feel free to provide some comments on what you think would be a minimum requirement for self-build projects.
Okay. I do want to say, and we'll put more in the comments about this idea that pre-cluster 15 projects, even if they reach COD, are not included and can't be included in the commercial operation date. I mean, we had a lot of discussions in the stakeholder group about the fact that, what if you had a PPA, you should be able to then come back into a group A or group B and the whole thing. And we were talking about projects at that point, not just technology additions. So is this a new thing? Or I guess I certainly didn't get out of the proposal when I read it, or anything earlier, that a pre-cluster 14 project reaching COD would not be eligible to request an allocation.
So I'm pretty confident that it is for, let me go back to that particular slide. I think we'll add that to your comments, because that is a pretty important part. And, I know what the slide says here is that the 2025 allocation group is the last one for PPA and shortlist allocations. So I think we need to clarify that one because it's not clear in my mind at this point.
Yeah, because in earlier
So we'll just need to clarify that.
In earlier discussions, it's your last chance to ask unless you build the project, and then you can come back and ask. And that was the context of a lot of the discussion before. So this seems like something brand new that I don't think is in the proposal or the written part, and certainly were not discussed earlier in that context. So we will put something in the comments about it. But I have the same question that some of the other people had about that, and then also the same issue about the earliest achievable COD. Is that the current COD, or if there's some earlier, if there's a COD that's in your GIA, but somehow you could come earlier if something happened. It's very unclear what is meant by earliest achievable COD as opposed to your current COD, maybe that you already, that you might already have in a GIA. I think that's pretty easily verifiable. But the earliest achievable seems like maybe it would be something different, perhaps, depending on the circumstances. So it seems like
typically
that
in the past been the earliest achievable COD as documented by the latest study report at the time that the request was submitted. That's how we've handled it in the past.
Okay, so all right, so for a project coming in on, and say a PPA group that may be an energy-only project, they've been in the queue for a while, you'd have to, maybe their GIA currently is different from what was in the last study, but maybe the last study was an MMA request to get their current GIA. Anyway, it would be good to have a little bit more clarity on that. So I appreciate your offering to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan, for all those questions. We do have one more hand, and then we had a question in the chat from Nebiyu Yaimer that said, does the TPD scoring criteria apply to WDAP projects?
Yes.
Okay, then our last hand is from Michael. Stacey, can you unmute Michael Freeman?
There you go. Okay. Michael Freeman, SE. This goes along with Susan's first question, which you've addressed, but I just wanted to ask for the PPA, has it been contemplated what stage that PPA is at? Is it just signed by both parties or also approved by the LRA? Or is that yet to be determined?
We took out the requirement or extra points for projects that were actually approved, regulatory approved. We found that that particular process for those that needed regulatory approval always went through that process, and it was something that was a leftover from what's in the BPM at this point in time. And we decided to take it out based on stakeholder comments.
Okay, so to make sure I understand correctly, for PPA between LLC and a third party, it's just an executed PPA, not yet achieved LRA. The LRA approval is not.
That's correct.
Okay,
that's no longer part of the process.
Okay, and then just a comment. We'll have this in our comments, but I think LLC owned projects should follow the same suit. So appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We have one more hand from Maya.
Hi, thank you. Maya Habib with Intersect Power. Bob, I just wanted to ask you a question. I'm quoting the straw proposal. Just want to make sure I understand, and I'm reconciliating what you're saying with what's in the proposal. The proposal says energy-only projects will only be eligible for an allocation through the commercial operation group, regardless of how they became energy-only. But you were saying
you're saying the straw proposal or the most recently posted revised straw proposal?
The revised straw proposal.
Okay. Yeah, as you can understand, this is a fairly complicated process, and that may be one item that I'm struggling to remember exactly right. So I'm going to have to check myself on that just to be sure.
Okay, totally fine. I just wanted to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you meant earlier. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Maya. That's all the questions we had.
Okay, let's move to the next, I think it's slide 15. Yes. So this first bullet is about how projects should seek an allocation. We wanted to kind of clarify and how projects seek an allocation, just to make it more plain from our side of how we track these projects. It's actually become a bit of a nightmare to track projects when they're seeking just megawatts for a particular project, and those megawatts aren't really tied necessarily to any technology of a multi-fuel project. So we are requesting that multi-fuel projects seeking an allocation under the PPA group will request specific megawatt capacity for each fuel type for which the project is seeking an allocation, and provide desired ranking order of each fuel type to be considered. I think that's pretty straightforward, but if you've got two fuel types and you'd rather see one of the fuel types, such as a battery storage, have first priority in the consideration over consideration for the other component, which may be solar, just tell us the order you want us to do that consideration for. And then any energy-only project other than through the technology additions that provides a PPA to modify its COD must provide a PPA that specifies an energy-only product. So energy-only projects cannot remain in the queue based on a PPA that is contingent upon receiving, that receives or requires TPD. So once a project is energy-only, and it's seeking to extend its COD, you can't do that on the basis of a PPA that may never be something that actually could play out because the project may never get full capacity delivery status. And this is something that if you have questions, I'd probably like Jason to bring his perspective on this, because he's the one that really deals on this end of the thing. So let's open it up for questions. This is the last slide that I have.
Okay, we currently have 2 questions in the queue. The first question is from Soumya.
Hi, I'm Soumya Shastri with PG&E. So if one is just from a generator perspective or from a project development perspective, I could envision where a generator, where a project may not have priority for all of one kind or all of another. It might be more tiered. So that is a possibility that I think that I think generators should project developers should comment on. But my question is just for clarification. So if a project is fully it fully doesn't get TPD for 3 years, then it has to withdraw. So if a multi-fuel project, if a portion of it gets TPD, then at the end of the 3 years, if the project has a PPA for that EO component, does it have to withdraw, or can that portion go forward as EO?
Yeah, please put that in your comments. We didn't address that, I don't believe, but my feeling on that is if it gets partial delivery status, that project can move forward in that mode.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Soumya, for your question. Our next hand is from Sanjay.
Hi, Songjie Zhu from Colors. So the question is, so if a FC project added technology as energy only, so that the energy component, could that stay with a PPA that is contingent on receiving TPD?
Jason, you want to weigh in on that? So you're talking about
I'm not sure
an energy-only addition that is an active project. It's not part of the project is actually in operation.
Because it has to remain energy only, because based on the rules on the previous slides, right? If the project adds something, it has to be energy only, cannot seek deliverability until it's operational. But then you have queue management rules. If it has a PPA that is contingent on deliverability, you will not allow it. So I just want to clarify for this
Yeah,
under
so
this situation.
if I'm understanding where you're going with this, Sanjay, I would say what we're trying to get to here is the PPA must be specific to the deliverability that you're seeking or that you have or not, right? So if the project is trying to make the argument that I have a PPA, therefore I should be able to remain in the queue, and your project is energy only, you cannot come to us with an RA or TPD PPA and make the argument that the energy only project can remain in the queue, right? And I would say this is effective after the 2025 cycle, whereby a PPA, an energy only project, could seek an allocation with a RA PPA in 2025.
Jason, I think the nuance here is the fact that for an addition, they have the capability to actually seek an allocation as commercial energy only. And if its COD is listed in the GIA that needs to be revised, that one we may have to open the door to allow them to provide a PPA that requires energy only if that's the path it's truly seeking. So Sanjay, add that to your comments so that we remember to address that issue.
Okay, thank you.
We have one question in the chat. It says, the table says allocation cycle 2025. I think this is actually for a different, I'm going to answer that offline. Our next hand is from Susan. Let's go to that. Her last hand in the queue.
Just to be clear, the table that's on slide 13 is for 2025 moving forward. This is the new criteria for that will be utilized for determining scoring. Okay, go ahead.
Let's go to Susan.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Yeah, I think you just get out of this whole thing by this corner by just saying you can have an energy, you can have a PPA that requires deliverability if you're still eligible to ask for it. And then if you're not eligible to ask for it anymore, then the PPA has to be energy only. I mean, I think that will sort of get you out of this, what about this situation and that situation? If they're still eligible to ask for TPD, then there shouldn't be anything wrong with having a PPA that is contingent on them getting it. If they're not eligible to ask for it, well, then it makes sense that the PPA can't require them to have it. So I think that's probably just, you could simplify this whole discussion with that kind of a rule.
I think that's logical.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Susan. We have no more hands or questions in the chat.
Okay, well, the next slide is, I'll turn it over to Daniel Mills.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, let's go to slide 16.
Okay, thanks everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll go to the next slide, please. We wanted to add a new dimension to this paper to talk through some of the issues that we began to explore in working groups around what to do with specific types of long lead time generation resources. And I think, the specific issues that we were trying to address were that we do have these specific types of location-constrained, policy-driven resources that take longer to develop. Both the generation and the transmission take longer to develop, and the procurement timelines in some cases are farther out. So there were three issues that we were looking at. I'm not sure if we've addressed all of them in our proposal, but we want to at least have this discussion. The first is that there's some uncertainty around when these types of resources should enter the queue. There's risk to entering the queue too soon, and there's also, of course, risk to entering the queue too late. But because the timelines differ so significantly from, development of, solar resources or in-state wind resources, we thought some special considerations or guidance around when to get into the queue may be helpful. Additionally, there's a question about how to find the best alignment between the amount of capacity that's specified in resource portfolios and the amount of deliverability that's actually sought by interconnection customers, and trying to get more alignment there. And then third, as I mentioned in the first bullet, there are more distant commercial milestones, or maybe some commercial uncertainty around when procurement will occur, that need to be considered and addressed as we're thinking through deliverability allocations. So we'll go to the next slide, please, and talk through some of our existing treatment of these types of resources. So as is described in the consolidated revised draw proposal, we do currently give certain long lead time resources points in the interconnection request scoring process. That's an outcome of the Track 2 initiative and approval there, and so that's occurring for Cluster 15 and going forward. And then also for some time, we have had the authority to reserve deliverability for certain long lead time generation resources. This is under Appendix KK, Section 8.9.1, and the revised draw proposal outlines instances where we have reserved this amount of TPD. So what we propose going forward is on the next slide, please, which is we do want to put some eligibility criteria to it. So, you know, we want this treatment to apply only to a particular set of resources that need it, not to one resource in particular, but to be open enough to address future resources that may be in the same situation. So we proposed that we would update the list of eligible resources each cluster or each year based on our coordination with the PUC and local regulatory authorities to ensure that there is alignment with policy needs and procurement needs. We did start to kind of sketch out what some of the criteria might look like for these types of resources, though, specifically, obviously, long lead time resource technologies. Several commenters on the working groups included specific resource types like offshore wind, out-of-state renewables with additional transmission needed, long-duration energy storage, and advanced geothermal. So we will coordinate with the PUC and LRAs on that. We also wanted to specify that these resources are likely location constrained, so not resources that you can put anywhere, and that these resources are, at least in the cases that we've had thus far with reserving transmission plan deliverability, dependent on policy-approved transmission with explicit guidance to treat the resource in that way, as long as the long lead time resource comes from the PUC or local regulatory authorities procurement plan. And so what we propose to do is actually quite simple. It's a pretty modest proposal. On the next slide, please, which is really just I skipped a slide ahead. So these resources have to enter the queue requesting the amounts of capacity that's appropriate and aligned with the amount of resources or the capacity that's specified in the resource portfolios. And then this is really just trying to ensure that we're reserving the appropriate amount of deliverability and that applying this to the right types of resources. Interconnection customers cannot request more TPD than specified from the LRA or the PUC. So in the next slide, what we're proposing to do is quite simple, which is really just they enter the queue and then we allow them to essentially hit pause and seek an extension for the amount of time that they would need before their first attempt to seek TPD. And so they can suspend this or get an extension until they're much closer to meeting critical milestones. If we go this route, we would need to do a couple of things. So we want to collect feedback first and then start you thinking about some of these concepts. We would want to establish some sort of deadline for when they would have to seek TPD that would align with the time frame for the resource coming online in the portfolio. So a resource that's supposed to come online by 2034 would have to seek TPD by, say, at least 2032 or something like that to indicate that they can't just sit in the queue and wait to seek TPD forever. And then we would also want to develop some conditions or some sort of trigger mechanism for releasing the amount of reserve TPD if the generation or the transmission does not materialize. And so this would likely come out of the transmission planning process and some decision there to either cancel or postpone a project. But we haven't put any definition on that proposal yet. Next slide, please. So just this is maybe more of a question going forward about what to do in this initiative, but we did have some questions for stakeholders on whether this proposed treatment of just allowing an extension of seeking TPD is sufficient, or if we should go further and contemplate either a separate interconnection request process altogether for these types of resources where they're all coming in at once, or if we should look at a separate study process or extensions to commercial readiness deposits and the GIA deposit. The latter two are probably more challenging issues and would require a lot more discussion and a lot more reconfiguration to make sure that those new processes, if we were to pursue them, would align with Order 2023 requirements. So I do want to put a disclaimer out there that I think if there's interest from stakeholders in pursuing a more discrete interconnection pathway for these types of resources than what we've proposed, we'd probably need to take that out of this initiative into an additional track of the interconnection process enhancements and deal with that separately on a different time frame so as not to hold up some of the other concepts that are in the revised draft proposal. So I will stop there and see if there are any specific questions or feedback. Of course, we welcome all of your comments on this as well in writing.
Now we have 5 hands currently in the queue. Our first hand is from Susan.
Hi, Susan Scheider, Phoenix Consulting. I admit I really was scratching my head over this whole discussion. So the first question I have is, there's some references to what's going on with the Cluster 15 process and the long lead time resources. And in the stakeholder process, we had discussed, I think, geothermal, out-of-state wind, and offshore wind. And then all of a sudden, I wouldn't say all of a sudden, but now it looks like long-duration energy storage has been thrown into this discussion. And I know there has been some discussion about that at the CPUC, but it wasn't talked about in the Track 2 discussion that led to the Cluster 15 process. Now, 8 hours of just batteries doesn't take any longer to build than, say, 4 hours of batteries. But I think there's some discussions of other long duration technologies or something in the CPUC proceeding. Can you clarify what exactly is eligible for the long lead time points boost in the Cluster 15 process?
I can. It's going to take me a second to pull that up, that specific language up. I know it's linked in the paper in the revised draft proposal.
For example, there's been no transmission approved for long lead time or long duration storage. There's been no transmission, as far as I know, approved for, say, geothermal. It seems very nebulous and unclear, and you know, and then putting in the long duration energy storage without some technology limitations or something, that seems to sort of open up a whole new category of things. So, and then I have some other questions, but this is just the only one I have for Cluster 15.
Okay. Let me pull up the definition that we have. If you can give me a minute. Sure. Because we did make it clear that that there has to be approved transmission for it.
Danielle, this is Bob. Just related to the actual generator itself, the requirement is it has to be a 12-hour duration energy storage project or more.
Okay, so 12-hour batteries even, does that qualify? Let me let Danielle answer and see. But
yeah, it's generic, so it doesn't specify what kind of storage technology would qualify. So anything that's 12 hours or longer. And while Danielle's looking up the issue around transmission, which we have discussed that internally, but we've gotten some questions related to Cluster 15. related to, well, what would qualify to get the points in cluster 15? And we've checked with legal and gotten confirmation that if a project puts in something like a 12-hour battery storage as one of the components of the project, if it later changes that component to be less than 12 hours or actually removes that component from its interconnection request, the whole interconnection request would have to be withdrawn. So the basis has to be maintained by which it was originally scored and got into the study process. Otherwise, the whole project would need to be removed.
Okay, well, that's helpful. But yeah, Danielle, did you find that, or I can just go on to some other questions too?
Yeah, no, I did. So each interconnection customer has to demonstrate it's been designated by an LRA as a long lead time resource. That's first. So there has to be, it's not just the PUC's definition, it also can be something that's defined by a non-CPUC jurisdictional LRA. Then it also has to meet the requirements of that LRA's resource portfolio and, importantly, correspond to an approved network upgrade in the transmission plan that are specifically designed to meet the long lead time resource needs of that LRA.
Okay.
So that, while we include long duration storage with a 12-hour or more or multiple day duration, it's critical that the resource also has a corresponding approved network upgrade.
Okay, and the CAISO has not approved any network upgrades up to now for long duration storage, right?
No.
Okay. The CAISO did hold back capacity in putting together the cluster 15 data for offshore wind, even though that was based on the last TPD allocation, which was before any upgrades were approved for offshore wind. And it seems like it's dismissed in like our question about that was dismissed in like one sentence in the proposal as well. We just didn't do that, but I think you did do that. You held back capacity for offshore wind, even though you were going off the prior TPP for the last TPD allocation, and there was no upgrade. In fact, it wasn't even in the portfolio, I don't think, in the base portfolio.
So the proposal, I'm sorry, I'm not sure which specific upgrade you're referring to, Susan, but the proposal does outline all of the deliverability that's held back so far and why, like what the basis for holding back that deliverability is.
But the basis wasn't approved transmission because there wasn't anything approved back for the cluster 14 TPD allocation. And yet you still held back capacity for offshore wind, even though no upgrades had been approved for the data you're working off of.
But the resources were in the portfolio.
Right, but you had not, no, they were not in the portfolio. They've been in the portfolio, they were in the portfolio for 2023, 2024, but you were working off the cluster 14 TP, my understanding is you're working off the cluster 14 TPD allocation, which was last done, in the numbers that came out for cluster 15, and that was based on the 2022, 2023 TPP, which did not have that in the portfolio.
So this is Binay. Susan, I'm not understanding. Can you be specific which one you're referring to?
Yeah, I'm gonna take this offline because it really more relates to the cluster 15 data. So let me ask some more questions just about this proposal. Okay, so can you go to slide 20, please? So when you're asking about the interconnection requests must enter requesting capacity appropriate for the amount specified for their resource. So I guess what I'm not understanding is, does that mean each interconnection request, if there's a certain amount in the portfolio, but when a developer submits an interconnection request, they don't know how many other interconnection requests are going to be submitted. And it could be that the totals will exceed the amount that is in the LRA's portfolio. So the question, and this LRA is multiple, I guess, but the question is, how will how can you control that if you don't know, if a developer doesn't know what other developers are doing?
So I think it's a good question, Susan. I think something to think about more and maybe modify the proposal going forward around. In the past, I think what has happened is interconnection customers are associated, like there is a project associated with what's in the portfolio that has a certain amount of deliverability associated with it. And so in that case, we want that amount of capacity and amount of TPD requested to align with the amount of capacity in the portfolio.
Right, but you
There
won't know. Oh, sorry, let me let you finish, sorry.
In the past, I don't think there has been necessarily competition for those resources because they are specific projects that are approved with a known developer and known capacity. Going forward, I understand that concern, and I think that's something that we'll have to look at. So please include that in your comments so that we can, take that into account.
Okay, because I think that's true of both of these items. Is that you can't really you just
Susan,
you
if
just
I could
don't know.
chime
Yeah,
in.
sure.
This is Bob. I mean, the idea is if there's, for example, 1,000 megawatts of TPD available that's been reserved for a long lead time resource, the project can't come in and request TPD for 2,000 megawatts and be treated in this manner for the entire project.
Okay, but what if you had 3 projects that were each 500 megawatts? They're still going to come in and it will exceed your 1,000. Is that okay?
And our intent was no.
Okay, so how? But they're
we
not
only
going to
have a certain
know
amount.
which
Well,
developers.
it doesn't matter what anybody else does, but one project can't exceed the amount that's available.
Right, but it's okay
receive
then.
this treatment.
Okay, no, and I get that, but it's okay then if 3 500 megawatt projects come in from, say, different developers, even though you have only 1,000 there, because no one developer has asked for more than the amount there, right? That would be okay?
That is correct. They're all competing for that capacity.
Okay, that was the nature of my question. So, okay, thank you. I appreciate your question about that. I will try and explain. I think we did explain our concerns about the offshore wind holdback for cluster 15. We'll try and do it again in the written comments, but we still have that concern, and we didn't feel it was addressed in the proposal. So we'll go ahead and make that comment again, and try and explain it better. All right. So thanks.
I also want to, this may be helpful to that issue, Susan, and if it's not, let's not belabor it and we'll just take it offline. But I think there are instances that we're sort of in the middle of right now where we plan to reserve deliverability based on what's in the portfolio, but haven't yet actually applied that TPD allocation. And so that may be where we're kind of getting.
No, I think the problem is that the base case you were working off of in the data that was put together for cluster 15 was from not this last transmission planning process, but the one before, because you were working off of the cluster 14 results. And that was from the prior TPP, which was 2022, 2023, which did not have offshore wind in the base case, did not approve any upgrades for it, for offshore wind. You only approved those in the 2023, 2024 case. And yet you still held back a bunch of capacity to see in what you said was available for cluster 15. And I think that was a mistake. If I'm understanding what happened here. So we'll try and explain it a little, maybe better than we did before, but it was one reason.
Yeah, that's where this has been just one last thing. That's where I was asking for you to be more specific. Are you talking about Humboldt? Are you talking about Central Coast? So yeah, let's take it offline, but if you can be more specific, what number you're talking about and for which area, that'll be helpful.
It was more of a general thing, and I think it probably made it worse in those areas, but there could have been repercussions, things that flow through the system that might have affected, say, adjoining areas or other areas. That it's not possible for us to really know that, but I think in general, the holdback is what I was questioning, because you had not yet for that data approved any upgrades for offshore wind. That only came in the plan that was approved approved in May. So anyway, we'll try and explain it more and hopefully clarify at least the question. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Susan. We have 3 more hands in the queue, and then we have 3 questions in the chat. Our next hand is from Aisha.
Hello. Hey, Danielle. My first question, I have a couple of clarifying questions. So my first question was on the location constraint. I was curious, like maybe this has come up or been explained earlier, but like what does location constraint mean? Is it like the offshore wind kind of locations, or there are other constraints that are being considered in this?
Yeah, I probably need a more articulate way of explaining it, but I think it relies on the resource availability, or I guess for lack of a better word, the fuel availability. So if it's offshore wind, you know, it has to be a good resource area, or a resource area that has been approved by the federal entities as you know, and given site control and things like that. For long duration storage, depending on the type of storage, it may have something to do with the type of resource that is being used for the storage, and whether that's something that I think in most cases, advanced geothermal, this applies too. There are only certain areas where that technology can be sited based on the local resources. And so those are location constraints, whereas large scale solar has much fewer locational constraints.
Okay, got it. That's helpful. My second question is on policy approved transmission projects. So is there like a lead time to, or any, if policy approved transmission project will make you qualify for this requirement? When I say lead time, like say the schedule for a particular project is 10 years versus 3 years. So I'm assuming policy projects generally are always very long lead times, but like, how are we, you know, like, just to, you know, like, if I am flagged with any policy driven project, I automatically qualify for this? Yeah, just was trying to get more specificity on this qualification.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's in the case of the eligibility, which I think may be on the previous slide, or maybe 2 slides forward. Let's see. Yeah, okay, this one. So I think we were thinking that it would be, to some extent, all of those bullets would have to apply, where it's a resource that shows up in the LRA portfolio that has a locational constraint and has approved transmission for it. I think the policy approved transmission, I don't think we've set any sort of time frame for like how long that transmission needs to take to be developed. But the fact that the transmission is being developed for that specific resource is the important piece of it.
Okay.
So if it's like, if it's a 3-year transmission project versus a 10-year transmission project, I didn't envision that making a difference, but it's a good question.
Okay, we'll add a comment on this. And one question that comes to mind when we are like just reading through this is, so this doesn't like there are projects in the queue, right, that are dependent on RNUs, and some of these RNUs are like 98-month schedule, like some of the short circuit duty issues for cluster 14. How is this situation different from that? Like, I was just curious, like if a project is delayed for 10 years due to an RNU, why can't that qualify for this versus like, you know, where are we drawing the line? That's why I asked the time duration question is, aren't projects that are impacted due to the long lead RNUs also like, you know, eligible, or shouldn't they also deserve this chance? Or is there a specific reason why only policy driven projects could qualify, but not the GI projects?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and something that we tried to kind of tease out in working groups. I think the particular difference here is that we are looking at transmission that's been approved for a specific resource, and there is a need to sort of reserve that transmission to suit or to enable that resource to develop. I can understand how for a delayed RNU that's the same case, but there are some nuanced differences there, right? Where it's still feasible to get a power purchase agreement for that project as you wait for that RNU to come online, or you know, there's competition at least for it
that's open to other technologies. But in this case, we are trying to make sure that we're really limiting the use of this approved transmission to its intended policy purpose.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, the option to defer could be a solution to those long lead time upgrades, but we didn't want to go down that route in this proposal because we have other mechanisms for dealing with it, like the conditional allocation group, and hopefully the willingness to engage in procurement as that RNU is being developed.
Yeah, no, I understand it. That's helpful. I guess like we would definitely put a comment. We feel like we should level the playing fields for everyone. And not, I mean, I think this has come up a lot of times. This is perceived as a preferential treatment. And because we really don't have control over the RNU schedules, what comes to mind is if more deliverability becomes available in the time that these projects defer their allocation request, then they get a benefit over the other projects. That is another, but I will put a comment on it. Don't want to take too much time, but do appreciate your explanation.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Aisha. Our next hand is from Soumya.
Hi, Soumya Shastri with PG&E. So Danielle, so I think we, at least for the LRA, just to clarify, and I have a question about the definition of what qualifies. And specifically, I'm thinking about what qualifies for holding deliverability, say for during the 2025 allocation process for a cluster 16 project. So the CPUC has to qualify the resource as a long lead time item, and the quantity, when you say it's in the plan, is that related to the specific bus bar?
Yes, but Vinay, well, I think so. Vinay, can you confirm that or answer that?
Sorry, I was doing something else. What was the question? Sorry.
The question is that the project, that the long lead time project size has to match what's in the plan, and we're talking about something that's locationally specific. So my clarification question is that, do you mean at the bus bar?
Yes.
Okay, that's probably a worthy clarification in the paper. So it has, and now the next question is about what is an approved network upgrade for that project. So looking, and my understanding is that there can be some upgrades that are just approved in general. They could be for reliability. And my question is why, in what situation and circumstance is an upgrade associated with a specific project? So to be the policy approved transmission with explicit guidance, because you could have, you could reserve the deliverability for a specific technology at a specific bus bar without the policy approved transmission. So where does that determination happen?
So I think, so this has been from CAISO's. So the Humboldt offshore wind and the 500 kV project that we approved last cycle, that's the example of where the upgrade is associated with the long lead time resource, policy resource, right? You're right. In some other cases, some of the long lead time, we may not need, there may not be direct link with the need for the transmission upgrade. So I guess that's where it comes back to what Daniel said. These criteria, is it all and criteria or criteria? We'll still have to work on it, right, Daniel? I think we'll have to continue to work on it. These are just the ideas that we're sharing, that this could be criteria. How, like the slide itself says, it's some or all. So we're still evaluating that. So it's not just that one criteria will determine in or out.
Okay, that's fair, because I think that's fair. We will put that in the comments. because I think while I understand Humboldt was specifically tied, there have been other, some of the other projects that are also being withheld. I don't know if they were specifically tied. So I think that we will discuss that in the comments. And I think going to that, there was one comment or one sentence in the proposal that I was unfamiliar with. It says, however, to the ISO's knowledge, no LDS resources have been identified as policy-driven in any of the CPUC or LRA resource portfolios. And I'm unfamiliar. Are you looking for a specific reference for something being policy-driven, or is it just being a long lead time item that is locationally dependent and identified as a long lead time item? Is that sufficient, or does it need to have some sort of special policy-driven designation? And what does that mean?
That is a good question. I would open that back up to stakeholders. I mean, we've been using policy approved transmission as the basis, but I also wonder if there has to be approved transmission for the resource regardless. I also wonder though, if the transmission resources are approved on an economic level or for reliability needs, those might also apply. But I haven't talked to the team internally about that, so I don't know how wedded we are to these having to be policy approved strictly.
Okay, thank you. We will address this.
Okay, thanks. The core piece though that we're trying to get at, sorry, Elena, just one other thing. Okay. The core piece that I think is important is that there has to be approved transmission. That's the part where the ISO feels that we have a really important role to play in making sure that the transmission that has been approved is being used for the specific purpose that it was approved for.
Thanks, Danielle. Okay, let's go to our hand from Renee.
Hi, this is Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. Aisha already kind of basically made my comment, but I just stayed in the queue to +1 the idea of the long lead time network upgrades being included in here. I think this is, essentially what some of us had put forward before with, being able to delay the time that you seek TPD. I think there is some complication with cluster 14 if you already got some allocation, if you're group D or something. Right now, would you be able to hold that, or would you have to kind of opt into this process to potentially lose it, I guess, or have it be at risk to get allocation later? So, I understand there's some things to work with, but, particularly for the upgrades that are, like 2032, for example, I think make it more challenging on the PPA side. So would just request again to think through that and whether there's more discussion that can be had on that. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Let's go to Mark.
Good morning, Danielle. Hi, it's Mark Smith with Calpine. I have a couple of points. First, you can add me to the chorus of Alicia or Aisha. In particular, we're seeing projects in clusters, say 12 to 14, that are being pushed out by delivery dates of equipment, both for PNUs and precursor network upgrades and reliability network upgrades, out 4 to 6 years from their original COD, and maybe even longer. And that puts all those contracts at risk in one way or another, even if you already have a PPA, because the confluence of events in the world today, including supply chain, which is causing the delays, and the potential for tariffs, could really create a nightmare in the PPA market. So we got to find a way to get these projects moving forward, and we're working on that with the vendors themselves. But I see no reason why, if I can't get assigned LGIA built within 6 years, that it shouldn't be able to preserve its deliverability for that whole time. And secondly, a question that came up, I guess, related to policy-driven upgrades. All of the north of Songs 500 kV transmission, you know, the 5 billion that was approved a couple of years ago, or maybe it was more than that, is policy-driven. So are you saying that all of that transmission and the deliverability associated with it is also going to be preserved in some way for entities that are seeking to interconnect, in particular busbar mapped position? I guess maybe it's a rhetorical question, Danielle. I mean, what is a policy-driven upgrade, and which ones specifically do you think are going to be sanctioned off and saved just for particular interconnections?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. I mean, the more I think we discuss this, the more I kind of look at those 3 bullets on this slide for eligibility as eligible projects needing to apply to all 3, needing to have all 3 of these bullets, right? They need to be a long lead time resource technology, location constrained, and dependent on policy approved transmission rather than just one of them.
Okay, so let's take the example of an interregional transmission project that's going to land on the eastern side of the ISO's border and will be advantaged by the 500 kV lines that go into north of Songs. Are you going to hold all that transmission for the interregional transfers? I mean, you don't have to answer that, but this is a really ambiguous set of circumstances, I think.
Okay, that's helpful
Danielle,
feedback.
This is Robert. We modeled the project that Mark's talking about in the 2024 TPD allocation process. We did model some MIC expansion that was in the portfolios, probably mostly New Mexico wind, but then we allocated a lot of deliverability to internal ISO resources because of that project. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Well, I guess, in other words, what you've done is you've generically allocated the incremental deliverability to projects already in the queue. You haven't preserved it specifically to accommodate the interconnection of an interregional transmission line.
I didn't know we were talking about interregional transmission lines, but we are preserving some MIC expansion for New Mexico wind. Whatever was in the portfolio at that time was in the TPD allocation model, and will continue to be in the TPD allocation model unless the CPUC removes it from the portfolio.
Okay. I'm with you, Danielle. We're going to have to think about these criteria a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
This is Bob. I just kind of wanted to speak up that some cases are pretty black and white, and others are much more nuanced. So the transmission line in the 500 kV line to Humboldt was put into the portfolio, and we got an approved transmission line that was, but for the fact that we want to bring in offshore wind, otherwise that project wouldn't be built. So that capacity, it's real black and white, that capacity that was only going for offshore wind based on the portfolio will be reserved for those. But there are other areas such as mid-coast area that already have capacity, and there's not necessarily new capacity being built to facilitate offshore in that area. And that's where it gets more nuanced. What is reserved and how do we determine what is reserved and that type of thing? So I agree, we have to work through this to get through those issues.
Yeah, Bob, I'm with you. I mean, if you were to, instead of having this be generic, if you had this specific to say that the upgrades that were suggested, the DC or AC lines that were suggested to incorporate offshore wind will be, the deliverability will be preserved for those resources, be specific like that, that's fine. And then in future, transmission plans, you can also be specific and say, we're going to build this line as a policy-driven upgrade, and and its deliverability will be for resources that were targeted based on the path of this transmission. I think specific is probably much better than these generic conditions that you're laying out, because I think they're too ambiguous. So think about that. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so we had a few questions in the chat. We have a question from Nancy Rader that said, could CAISO consider 150% limit for the total amount of capacity being requested for reservation by ICs rather than, quote, no more than, unquote, what LRA has requested?
I guess my question is, why would we do that? If we can't reserve more deliverability than is called for in the portfolio, as far as that's my understanding. So why would we go to 150%? And if you're not able to answer, Nancy, maybe that's something you can put in comments.
Nancy, if you want to raise your hand, make sure that participant panel is open, and then that hand icon is right at the bottom of that panel. It's a little hidden in this format. Let me read the next question, and we can come back and, oh, Nancy said she'll put in the comments. Thank you. And then we had a question from Nebiu Geimer. Has the CAISO considered developing a generally similar but separate TPD scoring criteria for Section 8.9.1 projects as Section 8.9.2 projects?
Not to my knowledge, but if that's something that you suggest, we'd take a look in comments.
Okay, and then one more question from Nebiu. Also, any changes to the deliverability retention requirements for long lead time resources?
No, we would propose, sorry if I failed to say that, but we would propose this ability to seek an extension to seek deliverability. But then once the project reinitiates that process of seeking deliverability, they would be subject to all the same rules as everyone else for TPD, allocation attempts, and retention requirements.
Thanks, Danielle. That completes all our chat questions and hands.
Okay, and I just, maybe before we move on, I just want to note what I'm hearing is a fair amount of, certainly that this proposal needs some work if we're going to move forward with it, but there's a lot of ambiguity on it. I get that. That's why we're talking about it now in this revised draw proposal phase, and if we need to pull it out into a separate track, we can. I'm not necessarily hearing a ton of support for the concept, except for support for potentially applying this treatment to non-long lead time resources, but resources with long lead time or delayed RNUs. So I just want to summarize that. Not hearing, I think we'll need to look at comments, but I encourage, if anyone is supportive of this idea or thinks it's workable, we do need to see some of that in comments. So just want to put that out there. And I can turn it now to, well, actually, I'm not sure if we're going to take a break now or if we're going to move on and power through with Robert. If you could advance
this
the
is
slide.
the end of your section. We're scheduled for a lunch break, and then we can come back and resume the next section, just so we can have a little rest over lunch, process everything.
Okay. Yeah,
we can come back. Danielle, do you want to come back an hour after at 12:48, or should we come back at 1?
I would say, just to keep this going and make sure that everyone has enough time for questions and things like that, I would say come back at 12:50 if that's feasible for people.
I can do that, thank you. And Silas, are you able to edit the slide just if anybody missed it and comes in at this lunch hour?
Yep, I can edit it now.
Okay, thanks so much. We will be returning in 1 hour.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Hello, everyone. We are back from lunch, and we are going to start here with Robert Sparks' presentation on the intra-cluster prioritization of use of existing SDC RNU headroom. Thanks, Robert. Take it away.
Thank you, Lena. Yeah, so good afternoon. So yeah, as was stated, I'll be going through the next iteration of this inter-cluster prioritization of existing system capability. The second round of that after stakeholder comments. Thank you for all the comments. We did incorporate most of them actually. So I'll just go through what all the slides look similar, but most people supported. In fact, I don't think everyone supported the proposal. Just had some tweaks here and there, so we incorporated those tweaks, and I'll go through the proposal with the updates. So just as far as background, several long lead time upgrades were identified in cluster 14 due to excessive amount of generation in the queue. The need for some of those transmission upgrades is expected to be eliminated as projects drop out. But unfortunately, the in-service dates for this generation currently reflects the 5 to 10 years it will take to complete the short circuit duty mitigation. And IC's raised a concern with that, and this proposal is to help provide some relief.
Can we go to the next page, please?
Oh, yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
So they've seen the slide pretty much anyway. Some of the generation projects in cluster 14 could probably interconnect without triggering the need for this short circuit duty mitigation, but not all of the projects. And that's kind of the nature of the proposal, is to leverage that concept. Next slide, please. So the ISO proposes an allocation process to allow generators within the same cluster to interconnect up to an amount that would not trigger the need for these required long lead time upgrades. The process would be similar to the TPD allocation process, and as a change to the proposal, the process would be ongoing and would be available to all cluster groups in the queue. Originally, we were just saying it was cluster 14 and earlier, but we heard your comments and revised that. Hopefully, we won't need it, but I guess just in case. Next slide, please. So another update is that originally we were just saying it was short circuit duty mitigation projects, because that's the main driver of this issue. But it was pointed out that there could be some other reliability network upgrades that have long lead times that are causing the same problem. And so all RNUs could be considered in this process, is the latest proposal, as long as they meet certain criteria, which is that the estimated time to construct the upgrade is at least 5 years, and the upgrade is delaying the in-service date of multiple generation projects in the same cluster by more than 3 years. Next slide, please. So generation projects in the affected cluster could then submit affidavits with similar information as the information that is submitted in the TPD allocation process. In fact, it could possibly be pretty much the same affidavit. And then the ISO would rank those projects similar to the TPD allocation process, and then provide those rankings to the PTOs. You know, the ISO does the TPD allocation, but the PTOs do the reliability analysis and determines, does the work identifying the reliability network upgrades as well, of course, with ISO participation somewhat. Then the PTOs would perform an assessment to allow the highest ranking projects to come online prior to the completion of the upgrade. Up until you know, the problem starts to present itself, then they would have to stop adding projects or allowing projects to come online. And then just as an example, using the short circuit example, if the project the projected short circuit current were to exceed 97% of the capability of the breakers, then essentially they would stop allocating generators that can come online. They would still identify more generators that, you know, could possibly come online, but any generators allocated above the 97% would need a limited operation study. Or, you know, would, you know, unless the PTO thinks that that's too much margin, then you know, perhaps they could if they think they can be more precise than that, great, and then perhaps we can go further. But we're putting out 97% as a suggested margin at this point. Next slide, please. So then you know, once they stop allocating, there's presumably still more projects that are in the queue and requiring this upgrade. And those projects would need to wait for the upgrade to be completed before those projects could come into service. And then all the projects that were originally assigned the cost responsibility, assuming they're still in the queue for that upgrade, would still be responsible for the cost responsibility, even though, you know, it's been determined that they can come online without the upgrade. They still need to fund it. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess actually that's the last slide. So with that, we can take questions.
Robert, we've got 2 hands in the queue. The first hand is from Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I had it's a little difficult to tell what the proposal was because there was a lot of for examples, and so you couldn't tell if the for example was the actual proposal or is that just an example of a proposal. So let me ask just a couple of clarifying questions. I think that it talked about the written proposal talked about implementing this in September 2025 with the actual TPD allocation process. Is that part of the proposal?
Yes, as it's, you know, it's pretty much always been the proposal to, well, actually we got stakeholder comments on that as well, but yes, the idea is to use similar information regarding the viability of the project, if you will, the status of the project that is collected for the TPD allocation process. And in fact, ideally, it'll be pretty much the exact same information. And so it makes sense to use the same affidavit collection process at the same time. And the next TPD allocation is scheduled for I think to request, I can't remember if the affidavits are due, or if the window opens, but anyway, in September 2025.
Yeah, okay. So I think some people were looking for...
The reason it was the example is that, you know, for 2026, it would be the same thing. Well, maybe not 2026. Well, 2026, there may not be one. 2027, it would be the same thing, and then 2028 and so on. So just rather than going into it ad nauseum, I just talked about the first example.
Okay, okay. I think some people were probably looking for something sooner. That's why I was trying to get clarification. And then when you say information similar to what gets submitted, are you saying would people have like a group A, B, C, and D, or are you just talking about the scoring that's the intra group scoring, or what sort of similar information are you thinking about? Like if you have an executed PPA, does that get you the highest priority, or I mean, can you sort of share a little more detail about that?
Yeah, I think the scores, you know, the affidavits are submitted, Bob Everett's group, and maybe even others get involved in looking at all of that information and then translating that into scores, essentially. The idea is pretty much use those exact same scores.
Well, they're not. The scoring is for allocations within a group. Like if there's some that's available to group A, but not enough for all of it, then they go to these scores. But are you looking at doing just the scoring part, or is there gonna be a group A, B, C, and D, or something like that, or some priority order, and then the scoring is within the group? That's the way the allocation is done. So is that what are you looking only to look at the numerical scores that they're going to be using within the group? Or are you going to be, is there like an A, B, C, D hierarchy based on executed PPAs and all of that?
Well, thankfully, Bob's group shields my group and Benet's group from all that detail. They give us scores for every project, pretty much.
Okay,
or at least they give us information so we can rank them, if you will. Exactly what the correct terminology is, but anyway, there's the ability to rank the projects, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in terms of order of allocation.
Okay, but
Susan,
okay,
this is Bob.
Yeah, hi, Bob.
Let me just say that Robert and I haven't sat down and really worked through the details, so I'm not absolutely sure, but we would have to do some scoring based on the associated reliability network upgrades. I don't know if that's by POI, if it's by, you know, study zone, or exactly how that is. So we'd have to figure out how to segment the various projects out that are together but unique from other areas. So we need to add the details to that. But once we've done that, then it would just be, I think, a numerical scoring. There's no different allocation groups. It's just what RNU are you actually behind and competing for to get online sooner.
Okay, so
we would just have to develop some scoring around that. And it's possible we could use the same scoring criteria as a TPD allocation process for that as well. But
Okay,
that
so
one we haven't really worked through.
Yeah. So you're looking at the intra-group scoring process. That's what you're really focusing on.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So not the ABCD.
That's a good point, because the scores only really matter for the same cluster in this process. But nevertheless, like what we did for cluster 14, I'm sorry, the 2024 TPD allocation was we scored the whole system. We had a big list of all the projects seeking deliverability, and we scored them all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down to how many there were, 150 or something. And then that gave basically a ranking. And even though obviously the PG&E scores didn't matter for the South and vice versa, we still just scored them all because then it gives you an order of priority. So whether they're all behind the same short circuit problem and all in the same cluster, it doesn't matter. They all have scores that could allow us to then rank them within that cluster for that problem.
Okay. But those scores are only used within each of the 4 main ABCD groups, or whatever they're going to be in the future. Okay.
Yeah, but
you're assuming they're all going to be in the same group.
Yeah, but so I'm using the term lowercase s score because you have A, B, C, D, and then a score for A. Well, then you can create a ranked list, you know, with A having a certain weight, B having a certain weight, sort of thing. So anyway, trust me, we can create a list of a ranked list of the projects.
Okay, so it may be something like the intra-group scoring system that you use now within each of the 4 groups. Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry, I'm not quite following what you're saying.
We, to be honest, we don't care what group it's in. It just once we create the scores or the rankings, then obviously Group A, they get the allocations first, and then it moves into Group B. But the scores are set up so that A gets it first, B gets it second, and then the the smaller the other scoring for the A.
Are you going to do A, B, C, D, or are you going to ignore A, B, C, D and just do the number scores?
Yeah, Susan, this is Bob. There is no need to have the various allocation groups, A, B, C, and D. I believe the scoring process is adequate to where projects get points if they have a PPA. So project with a PPA would be at the top of the list. So that's kind of like, it has some component of Group A, getting a higher score. So I think the existing scoring process could work for this process. There may be some additional scoring components that might be appropriate to consider for this. So I would suggest stakeholders who have projects that are in this mode and the understanding of the issue and all of the technical aspects around it, if you have some ideas of some other highly significant scoring parameters that we ought to use in that we could do that. But yes, it would just be the scoring criteria that's used within any allocation
within
group.
any group. Okay.
Right.
All right. So effectively, you're going to just
need for other groups.
Yeah. So effectively, they're going to be all within the same group. That are ones that are associated with this particular RNU, and I'm assuming the ones that people have to apply. So you assume people who would apply would be only ones that want to move their CODs forward.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so you're not going to score a bunch of everybody. You're just going to do the people who request it, right?
Well, that's the Bob, but I'm saying if we just had one list for the TPD allocation, I think we could almost use that same list. Because the only other thing that's come up is, well, if they're waiting on some other upgrade, then that should be part of the scoring. But instead, what the proposal right now is, if they're waiting on another upgrade, well, then that's used to determine how much they're being delayed. So if they're waiting, if they're behind a long lead time upgrade that takes 8 years, but they're waiting for a deliverability upgrade that takes 7 years, well, then that's only like a 1-year delay. So they don't even qualify anyway.
Okay. And you'd be looking, I assume, at their PTO's interconnection facility timelines as well?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes.
Okay. Because some of those could be long lead time. And so if you wanted to see how long you're being delayed, you'd have to look at everything, right? The PTO's interconnection facilities and also the network upgrades.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so it sounds like you haven't really settled on a scoring thing. You're going to treat everybody being in the same group, as being in the same group, and not the ABCD, just the numeric scores. And it may be the scoring scheme that you have for the allocation process, or you're proposing for the allocation process, or it could be some modification of that. Does that sound right?
Could be, but I'm hoping it'll be pretty much identical to what's being used for TPD allocation.
Okay. And okay, I think that, thank you. It wasn't, and when will you decide the process? Is it going to be closer to September, or like what does the scoring look like exactly? So what's in the proposal now is very vague, and that's why. But I mean, you have a while till you get to September, so I assume you'll at some point put out the actual proposal, or is that going to be in the next version of this proposal, or is it going to be some other time?
What the proposal says is that it's pretty much going to be the same as the TPD allocation. Now the TPD allocation process
and it says, for example, and it says, yeah, okay.
Yeah, similar to that. That'll give us a little bit of flexibility, but then, Bob and I have to sit down and figure out, can we use the words that's going to be exactly the same, or does Bob want to do something different?
Okay, and with whatever your actual proposal is, will that be in the next version of in this initiative, or come out some other time?
It'll be in the final version for sure, and I presume in the next version.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, I didn't mean it had to be the next version, but maybe that will be the final. Who knows? But okay, so it's going to be in this initiative though, and not like close, not like in August or something.
Right. And Susan, just to be clear about this, it has to be in the tariff. As much as I'd like to have the scoring process totally be in the BPM where we can make tweaks to it as we see necessary, our legal team has felt it's been appropriate to, basically be a rate in the rate term and condition type category and be in the tariff itself. While the points can change, the actual components need to be in the tariff. So we'll have to decide within this actual initiative what it'll be. As Robert has it now, it's the same as the TPD allocations process. So if anybody has any strong opinions about doing something differently, now's the time to speak up. Otherwise, it'll be the same as the TPD allocation scoring mechanism.
Okay, because I thought the intra-group scoring was in the BPMs and not in the tariff. Only the main groups A, B, C, D are in the tariff.
The actual groups are in the tariff, and the scoring components are in the tariff. However, the points are in the BPM. So as much as I wanted to actually change in the BPM as far as actual components, I've been told, no, I can't do that. You can change the points, but you can't change the components that are being scored.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, thank you for all these clarifications. I wasn't sure I understood the proposal, and I really appreciate your providing some of these details.
Susan, for all those questions, we've got a couple more hands in the queue. Our next hand is from Sanjay.
Robert, this is Sonja from Colors. I have two questions. First is about the time frame of this allocation. So it sounds like it will happen during the same time period when you do the TPD allocation. So like for a project, let's say Cluster 15 project, it has a 10-year lead time upgrade, but the allocation will happen maybe after the facility study is completed. Is that right? Is that understanding correct?
I see what you're getting at. Yeah, I mean, yes, it should. They need to know, they need to be through their interconnection studies. Now for cluster 14, or I guess, for cluster 14, they already have their phase 2 reports done. So, and this is mostly targeted for cluster 14. Like I said, hopefully we won't need it for cluster 15. If we do, then yeah, it would be after the facility study.
Yeah, so okay, so for cluster 14, let's say you do it in September 2025. Then after that, are you going to update it every year because things could change and some projects will push out COD for other reasons, right? Will you consider that?
Well, that's why it's ongoing to try and, if that is necessary. But I mean, all the projects that are not responding, they do not need to wait for the upgrade. They don't need to wait for the upgrade. So that's not going to change. It's just a matter of some of them drop out and somebody else wants some. Well, then in the next allocation process, we would, and assuming we can, we would allocate what became available because somebody dropped out. But we're not going to go back and change somebody, say, oh, by the way, we gave you the answer last year and now it's changed again. So that we're not going to reevaluate that.
Also, like for the project that, say, the first year it gets an allocation to come online early, but then for some reason it has to push out COD, and then they will still hold that allocation regardless, even though now they have a much later COD.
Oh, okay. Now there is a piece in there about them. There was a proposal from a stakeholder. Unfortunately, we didn't fully work out that because that involves other than just the engineering group. But yeah, there was a proposal. I forget what it was. I think it might have been like kick them out of the queue or something like that, which sounds good to me. If they decide to change, because they're, but I forget. But anyway, we're still evaluating that proposal. But again, that's not like we're gonna take it away from them. We're basically just gonna kick them out of the queue under that proposal. You know, maybe there is something like that, but we haven't. We're still working on that.
Okay. So the second question is, does this get rid of the limited operational study? So, like for example, if the RNU is a RAS, this project doesn't get allocation to come online before the RAS is in service, then could the project still request the LOS 9 months before the in-service date and just maybe can use congestion management to come online earlier?
Trying to make sure I understand the scenario. So they have a long lead time upgrade, which is more than 5 years, or 5 years or more. And oh, I see. And then they don't have to wait for that upgrade, but we would factor in the RAS, and if the RAS takes 3 years, and it's a long lead time upgrade that takes 5 years, well then they wouldn't even qualify anyway. If I guess if it was a 6-year long lead time project and the RAS is again 3 years, then I guess they would qualify. And yeah, if they wanted to use a limited operation study to come online before the RAS, they could, or they could just come online in 3 years when the RAS is done.
Sometimes the RAS gets delayed several years. It happened before, right? So if RAS itself is the delayed upgrade, then could they still do a limited operation study to come online earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought that's what I was answering, but yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. We have one more hand from Mark.
Hey, Robert, Mark Smith with Calpine. First of all, thanks. I think, this proposal makes a lot of sense, I think, to many of us. There are some questions that need to be resolved, but this really does make sense. First is a simple question. The individual interconnection requests impact on the network upgrade. The magnitude of that impact is irrelevant here, right? So if you have an overstressed breaker and one IR contributes 700 amps to that and another only contributes 100 amps to that, that's irrelevant to this analysis, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I thought. Now, the more complicated question, I understand that the analysis will be within a cluster, it sounds like. You'll be comparing one interconnection request to another, but many interconnection requests have precursor network upgrades that are triggered by, previous clusters. How would those precursor network upgrades also be considered in this process?
If they satisfy the criteria, yes.
So if a precursor network upgrade delayed you by 5 years, and you have a PPA and an LGIA, and otherwise you score very highly, you could be considered as an eligible customer to not need that precursor network upgrade.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks, Robert. That's it.
Thank you, Mark. And we just got one more hand from Alan.
Hi, this is Alan Combs for New Energy Works Consulting. So I'm curious if there will be any information published on how much available margin is available for these long lead time upgrades. They're mostly short circuit duty upgrades at specific breakers. So I assume there's going to be some calculation of margin in the year before operating date, because that's, if you're going to allow a project on, you have to anticipate that it could operate without the upgrade, I assume. Will any of that information get published before people make an effort to get scored and also make contracting decisions? I mean, you have to still contract against this risk of trying to get online early. Thank you.
I imagine there could be some sort of report that could get published. I'm not sure what it would. I guess I'm not quite sure the angle you're looking at this from, because the idea is if you're waiting for a long lead time upgrade and you don't want to wait for it, then you submit your affidavit. I guess it does cost like $10,000, but you're probably already submitting that for the TPD allocation process. And whether you have to pay twice or not, I don't know. I guess we need to work out that detail as well. But the idea is that it's probably in your best interest to I guess, participate in the process and see if you can, come online before the upgrade. And then, once we've gone through, most likely we'll end up allocating everything. And so there really, we'll be at probably 97% or maybe even 100% of what can come online. So after we do it once, I think everything's going to be gone.
Okay. Well, let me just convey, and we can put in comments, but some of these projects are going to spend very substantial resources to move forward on permitting, to move forward on funding the plan of service upgrades, signing the IA, contracting. All these things maintain the in-service date of the interconnection facilities and the plan of service RNUs or IRNUs, the ability to get a contract, all these things that you would use either just to maintain your in-service date, your milestone dates, or get a good score. And if you do all that, but there's only like 100 amps of margin to allocate, meaning only one project is going to get in, that would be very, very helpful to know in advance of providing a score. Just as, knowing the TPD availability was very important.
Yeah, I think your Cluster 14 Phase 2 report provides that information already.
Okay, so you're basically telling everybody has, actually, I'm not sure it does because there's pre-Cluster 14 projects you have to kind of consider, but you're basically just leaving everybody to figure this out through the available
You're
studies.
behind all those pre-Cluster 14 projects. If there's no room, so essentially if it's already overloaded because it's a Cluster 13, well then really the competition is for Cluster 13. Cluster 14 doesn't even really qualify.
So, all right, on that one, then you're saying all pre-Cluster 14 projects are going to be online before the in-service of the upgrade. There could be some. There could be some.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they have priority. So if they do come online, they're ahead of you. And we're not going to change your in-service date if that's the case, because we have to assume they're going to that they will come online. Yeah, this process is not it's not free for all for everybody, and then we're getting all of a sudden now Cluster 14 gets ahead of Cluster 13. This is only intra-cluster. That's the whole name of the thing, and my understanding of the term intra-cluster is that it only applies to Cluster 14, against Cluster 14, or Cluster 13 against Cluster 13. But Cluster 13 is ahead of Cluster 14.
So Cluster 13, so even if the prior cluster gets priority, unless, of course, they drop out and you'll reflect it in a reassessment. I mean, prior cluster projects drop out and then you take them out. But you're saying you won't look to their in-service dates to decide whether they count or not. You'll count them if they're still in the queue.
Yes, because this is because we're essentially going to waive the limited operation study, and we're going to change the in-service date in the LGIA.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I think you're subject to there are project dropouts. You're saying it's up to the project developers to do their own assessments of how much margin is available at each long lead time upgrade. So, thank you.
Remember where this started. This started with Cluster 14, which is kind of the first super cluster, if you will. Maybe we had some years ago, but it was the first modern day super cluster, and so it was mostly focused on Cluster 14, and so it was all Cluster 14 versus Cluster 14. We acknowledged that there could be some other earlier ones, so we had already but for the most part, it was focused on solving the cluster 14 supercluster problem.
Yes, and there are pre-cluster 14 projects that have a significant short circuit duty impact on some of these upgrades that have eaten up a lot of margin. Look, you've answered the question. You're going to count them whether they're viable or not until they drop out. Then I assume you'll take them out. But I just want to understand the proposal, so that helps. Thank you.
Thanks for those questions, Alan. We have another hand from Aisha.
So hi, yeah, I think follow up to that. So SC published data on margins available pre-cluster 14 on circuit breakers that were overloaded and had long lead time. Is this the information that CAISO will use to basically determine, like how much margin is available and at what time, at what point they need to cap it? Or will SC be publishing a newer version of that database, maybe after the restudy this year, to identify, okay, based on some, I don't know if there will be any cluster 13 dropouts or not, but like if some more margin became available. Because I know like SE did publish the data on the margins, and I think, I'm not sure if that's available on the public forum. It was at least individually communicated to the project owners of cluster 14 projects who were being affected. But I do agree with the point, like maybe some more margin gets available. So we were curious, like what will be CAISO's reference to make this decision? The information that's already out there, or a newer version of that information?
Yeah, so I wanted to first kind of reset, or restate what I said before, was that the ISO is not going to do this analysis. The ISO is going to create the ranked list of applicants, I suppose, and provide that information to the PTO, and the PTO is going to actually figure out how many of these projects can come online without the upgrade, and how many cannot, sort of thing. Yes, they'll use the latest available information that they have.
Can CAISO coordinate with SC and PG&E to clarify if they're going to be issuing a newer version of that margin information that they issued right after phase 2 results? That will be very helpful.
I think that margin information was based on in-service dates and not really based on queue priority. So I think it's a little bit different information.
Okay.
But yeah, the idea is that they'll use all available information that they already have, so it's they can sort of predict which ones can come online and which ones cannot, and then run a study to test to see if that actually is true, and if it's not, maybe have to adjust a little bit. That's my understanding of what they're planning on doing. But whether they're going to publish more information, I mean, they did that, kind of like as a courtesy, and I don't know if they're planning on updating that or not. But that was sort of produced because there was no other mechanism to try and figure out which generators can come online. This is meant to be more definitive, and so you won't have to, rely on information that's non-binding. You'll have binding information.
I'm a little confused because I was pretty convinced a few minutes ago that margin information was what we were supposed to use to not go through a limited operation study. That was SC's way of sharing the information. And then they said, yeah, this whole priority thing was now, added in the IPE track. At that time, they didn't share very clear guidance on how do you claim that margin. Now you're telling me that is not that information. There is something else. Maybe I can like coordinate offline on this, but like understanding the right source of where we refer to those available margins will be super helpful to make a decision on viable, like, whether we want to participate in this ranking next year or not. So if we can get any additional information or clarification on the source, that will be helpful in the next version or some other, like market notice or something.
So I think I heard you say something that was pretty important, but I think was incorrect.
Okay.
I thought I heard you
Please
say
correct
that
me.
you thought that the information that was produced by the PTOs,
Yes.
these informational margins, was going to be used so that the limited operation study would not be required. I thought that's what I heard you say. If that's what you said, that's not correct. Limited operation study is always required, with the exception of this proposal.
Which is that based on ranking and available margin, you will be allowed to come online sooner.
Without a limited operation study, correct. Assuming there's adequate margin, and that's where the 97% number was intended to draw the line.
Okay. All right. Thank you for correcting me. Kind of feel like it's alluding to the same, but I get it. Thank you for the correction. So it is, I guess the point on the margin is still open. Like, where do we identify the exact available margins? Can KAISO coordinate with PTU to share that source in a subsequent version or a market notice, or do you recommend we reach out to PTOs separately to clarify this?
Well, like I told Alan, I believe the Cluster 14 Phase 2 report gives you that margin.
So that is the information. Okay. All right. Yeah. I guess we've just been going in circles on the same thing. Okay, that's super helpful. I think we will take that and we'll put this in the comment also, but if we can also like check with PTO on the back end, like if there are any further confusions. But do appreciate you answering my questions. Thank you.
Alicia, we have another hand from Mark.
Hey, Robert. So we talked about precursor network upgrades, and then in your conversation with Alan, I got confused again. So it sounds like this is an intra-cluster analysis. So if something is triggered in cluster 12 or 13, you're going to look at only 12 wherever it was triggered, say in cluster 12, and you'll allocate whatever headroom is available to cluster 12. If that headroom is not fully used by that cluster, or because the people in that cluster don't score very high, are you going to look at the future clusters where it's a precursor network upgrade and allocate it potentially to subsequent clusters? I know I'm getting into more details probably than you're prepared to discuss.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So there was a couple things that I wanted to correct, but the first one is one possible scenario is that it is a precursor network, say triggered by cluster 12, but now enough generators have withdrawn, so cluster 12 doesn't need it anymore. And maybe you're lucky enough, cluster 13 doesn't need it anymore, but cluster 14 does. And so we would use it for we could, and maybe some cluster 14 projects can come online even without that precursor network upgrade. So that's one scenario where my original simple answer would apply, right, to cluster 14 at least.
Okay, that's what
we're not going to do is look at cluster 12, 13, and 14 all together and figure out who gets to come online cluster 12 is first, cluster 13 second, and then cluster 14. And then if you run out before you get all of cluster 14, then that's where we would apply this process.
Okay, so if somebody in the same hypothetical, if somebody in cluster 14, is ready to go COD right now, and they're waiting for something from cluster 12, but there's still plenty of interconnection requests in cluster 12, and nobody really scores too high in cluster 12, you're still going to hold that capacity for cluster 12 entities. You're not going to go inter-cluster scoring evaluation.
For this process, yes.
Okay, thanks. That's a good clarification. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Mark. We have another hand from Kaushal.
Hi. So I think I've asked this question before to, I think, Bob, but he deferred me to you, I think. So I think it's about a cluster 14 WD project, which has PPA, but somehow it was not able to participate in the 2024 TPD study. So I think Bob mentioned that that could be possibly take part in the interim deliverability process. So if that WD project with the PPA want to participate in a TPD study, the next is going to be in 2026, but somehow the COD is going to be in the same timeline to meet the COD. Is this interim process can help this project to at least get interim TPD allocated? And
yeah, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and so that, I mean, it can meet the COD timely and the project doesn't have to get delayed or delay the COD, basically.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple more slides. There were two Track 3B proposals, and I think Bob was alluding to the second Track 3B proposal, which was about interim deliverability. This process is, well, actually, in fact, I'm looking at the, I don't, I'm controlling the slides, but anyway, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is interim deliverability. What we're talking about right now and taking questions on is the previous slides that I covered, and that is not about deliverability. And so it would not apply to your situation that you're bringing up. But I think you said that your project does not have a TPD allocation, and I think that's what I heard you say. And so in that case, you are not eligible for interim deliverability either. You basically have to wait until the next TPD allocation process. Then once you get a TPD allocation, and you're waiting for some upgrades, which is possible, that's when you're eligible for interim deliverability, if there is any available on a year-by-year basis.
But and it doesn't matter the project is PPA or not, right? Because our objective was to not delay the project and meet the COD. And if we wait for the delayed 2026 TPD, I mean, this TPD was supposed to be 2025, but Cal ISO changed it, where they're skipping the 2025 and they're.
Well, yeah, well, September 2025 is when we're collecting the affidavits. So, yeah, maybe it won't be done until early 2026, but yeah, that's the next opportunity, which is, I guess, about 9 months from now or so, at least 10 months.
Yeah, and I think that's why some of the projects like us are kind of hurting them, because I think by missing that 2024, we were thinking we're going to be participating in 2025, which I think is getting skipped. Now 2026 would be the next availability TPD to participate. I think so. That's why we were thinking, is there any interim process for such project where at least they can have an interim TPD allocated, and then basically they can meet the COD and they don't have to delay the project. So, but you're saying is the only 2026 is the only possible way out.
I think we're calling it the 2025 TPD, but that's kind of quibbling, but yes.
Yeah, because usually it was starting in November. The affidavits were basically submitting in previous TPD. They were submitted in November and the study started in January. But for 2025, I think there is no studies done in 2025. It's going to start in 2026. So that's where there's a kind of a year gap there. And we were trying to save that time and meet our COD dates, basically. So, but is there any other offline we can connect to you guys? Are you the right person to connect offline about our specific project?
Where's your project, if you don't mind saying?
It's in PG&E. It's a WD project in PG&E.
My colleague Benet Shrestha would be your contact.
Is the right contact?
Benet?
Okay.
Or Bob. Both.
Sounds
both
good. Yeah.
Bob, okay.
Good, Russell. You can reach out to me, and we'll see what the situation
All right,
is.
thank you. Thank you, Robert.
That concludes all the questions and hands we have.
Great. Well, the next slide, please. So the next proposal was, like I mentioned, around interim deliverability, and the ISO observed that when storage projects are added through the MMA process, this could allow the storage project to jump ahead of generators already in the queue when interim deliverability is allocated. So the ISO proposed to change the interim deliverability allocation priority to address this issue. And we talked about that in the last meeting. And we collected your comments again. And next slide, please. So unlike the last proposal, where almost everyone supported it, in this proposal, almost no one supported it. And many stakeholders expressed concern with changing the current priority because they've already made business decisions based on the current priority order. Some suggested, that they could support the proposal as long as the current projects already in the process are grandfathered under the existing priority. And so that was, in a nutshell, the stakeholder feedback. Next slide, please. So after reviewing the comments and internal discussions, the ISO is no longer proposing to modify the priority for interim deliverability. We're not expecting, we had a big flurry of battery facility additions through the MMA process. We had this batch MMA process in 2019, 2020, where like almost 10,000 megawatts came through in MMAs. We also had like a real resource shortage event in 2020. The portfolios then exploded and the queue exploded, of course, and the MMAs exploded as well. And, we don't expect that to be happening going forward. So, basically the barn door's open, the cows are all out, we can't bring them back. And then trying to grandfather the different priorities would create undue complexity in the interim deliverability allocation process, and when it's just a year-by-year temporary allocation anyway. So we're not proposing to modify the priority anymore for allocating interim deliverability. And I think that's the last slide. Any questions?
There are currently no hands and no questions in the chat. Bob, would you like to go over kind of this section here, since we do have a little bit of time? Robert, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, let's go through this pretty quickly. I don't know if I'll go into any details, but maybe the best thing is to allow people to ask questions. So let's go to the next slide, please. So even though we've done our riff and put out a lot of information related to all of the deposit structures that are ongoing, there's a lot of questions going on. So we decided to put these additional slides in this presentation And, you know, granted, this isn't necessarily just a cluster 15 group. Understand a lot of people here have projects associated with cluster 15, and if you do, please make sure this information gets to the appropriate people. It kind of appears from our perspective that while we've trained certain people, that trained information is not getting down to the people that are actually doing the work and making, you know, performing these individual deposit functions. And so we're seeing a lot of problems and related to, you know, for example, the study deposit that comes to the ISO, we've had to return a bunch of those because they're not following the criteria. And with cluster 15 having so many projects in it, we really need people to follow these procedures. So we put them in place so that we can really facilitate the vast number of projects that are coming into us. So this particular slide goes into the deposits and fees. You know, which ones go to the ISO, which one goes to the PTOs. I've got some additional information related to the commercial readiness deposit and so forth. The one thing to speak about, you know, the application fee is pretty straightforward. The study deposit is basically a true up of you know, some people, even though we said we aren't doing this, some people just continue to assume that we are going to refund the original deposit and they need to provide the new deposit in full. That's not the case. We are holding your current deposit, and whatever the true up needs to be, whether it needs to be more, provide that additional amount to true it up to the full amount that is needed by the tariff. So projects that are less than 80 megawatts, you'll be getting some money back. Projects that are greater than 80 megawatts, your deposit stands as is because it's the same as it was before. If you're greater than 200 megawatts, your deposit has increased, so you need to true it up to the new amount of $250,000. So any questions about, well, let me just go through this whole thing and open up to questions after we're done. So let's go to the next slide. So this kind of gets into the more of the details of the deposits fees. And so I don't know if I necessarily want to go through all of this, but the main thing I really want people to get is what each wire requires, which is at the bottom of this slide. We need to have your project name on the wire. We'd like also to have the project number from the Cluster 15 project list on the ISO website. So with those two informations, we'll be assured to be able to match this, the wire that you send to the ISO with your actual project. And also, we need a separate wire for each deposit. So we need a wire for your application fee and then a separate wire for your study deposit. And if by chance you do meet the requirements for being able to do a site control deposit, we need a separate wire for that one. And each of these wires need to have that same information of project name and project number. Let's move to the next slide. So this is related to the commercial readiness deposit, and if applicable, the merchant option deposit that go to the PTO. And these are the same form of financial instruments that people have been using for the interconnection financial security initial, second, and third posting associated with Appendix DD. So you're working with the PTOs on this. Originally, we said that the financial instruments needed to be fully executed and in place by the close of the window on December 2nd. After working with the PTOs and realizing that was going to be very difficult for the PTOs to actually accomplish with most customers, we decided to back off on that. We felt we have tariff authority to be able to do this. So what we are now requiring is that by December 2nd, and let me just say this, in order to submit your interconnection request, you have to have all your documents in the application before you submit it. And one of the documents is going to be your commercial readiness deposit information. your documentation for that. What we want for that documentation is, at a minimum, a working draft of your financial instrument that the PTO has agreed to and is working with you to accomplish completing that particular instrument. We will be checking with the PTO to ensure that, yes, they've agreed to it, they've seen it, and they agree that you're in a process of working through on a good faith basis to complete that financial instrument. And there is no cure period beyond the December 2nd date. So you need to have all of that accomplished. The merchant deposit is the same thing, same exact items. It is an additional deposit based on $10,000 per megawatt, and the max and mins are in the tariff. So you'll be following that same procedure for that particular item as well. And people have asked, well, I've got an email saying, that my intent to do something has been accepted by the PTO. We're not going to be going by some email that says, well, our intent to do something has been accepted. We need to see actual performance of a draft document that the PTO has accepted. And draft documents don't mean, well, I've uploaded what the PTO has posted for us to use, but it's blank. It's got to be filled out to where the PTO has agreed, yes, this is appropriate for this particular document. Let's go to the next slide. And then to close out the commercial readiness deposit as well as the merchant deposit, they all have to be done in place by May 1st. And again, there's no cure period beyond May 1st. And these documents at that time need to be a fully executed commercial readiness deposit, financial instrument, same thing for the merchant deposit. And here at the bottom is the email that hopefully you all already know and are using. If you have any additional questions beyond this, feel free to email us there. So with that, are there any questions on any of this?
Currently have one hand from Aisha.
I have a question on the LCs for commercial readiness deposit. I'm not sure if others have experienced this, but we have followed up twice with the PTO on responding to our LC draft. I think with the first email, I even copied Kaisa and they said you don't need to copy us. I don't know. We are ready to submit our IOs, but we haven't really heard back anything from the PTO. And we ended up then finalizing the LC because we had to make the submission. How do you advise we navigate the situation? We go ahead, submit the IR with our version of the LC and then wait for Kaisa to work with PTO, or is there a contact at the PTO that you think I should loop in to get any response, on their deadlines?
If you're running into problems where you're not getting a response from the PTO, please send an email to IR info and we'll work with those PTOs. We've been in meetings with them.
Okay, I can forward our follow-up email on the LC to the IR info today. I'd really appreciate any support we can get. We are ready to submit IR. This was the one piece I wasn't sure of, but do you think we should wait for Kaisa to resolve this, or should we go ahead and submit the IR and then work through the correction window on further actions?
I would try to get this resolved before you submit it, but if by chance you don't, I would go ahead and submit your IR with what you have available, with a fully completed draft document, and we'll work through it from there. And hopefully that won't be the case.
We used the template that was posted on the website. We reached out to them the first time, a couple of weeks in advance. They didn't respond, followed up again. No response yet. I'm not sure, I can keep following up, but if they don't respond, I'm not sure what else we can do.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not giving anybody an out by saying, okay, if I don't want to put us in the situation where people are then claiming, well, the PTO never got back to us, therefore I'm just submitting this. and the ISO should accept that. We are going to, the PTOs will be providing us information of what they've done with every customer, and if they've gotten some level of emails from the customer and you've demonstrated that you've given them some time and done your all due diligence to try to contact them, that will play into our decision. And I would assume we'd allow something like that. But if the PTO says, I never got an email, never got anything from this customer, we're going to say, okay, you haven't been in a good faith process with the PTO. And I will also say, I forgot to mention, we will put another document up online that has the contact list of each of the PTOs. It was my impression that each of the documents had emails to each PTO in them, and in some of those I didn't find the email, so I thought, okay, this isn't as smooth a way for people to figure out who to contact at the PTO as I would like. So we're going to post another document that will have the contact list as well as all of these instructions on a document. And if someone could mute their phone, I'm getting a lot of background noise.
That was probably me. So that's what I was gonna say. So we emailed to the email provided in the template.
I'm sorry, Aisha, I'm getting more noise than hearing you, so I'm not hearing.
Is it still? Are you still hearing background noise? I'm not sure.
Okay, that's better.
Okay, yeah. I'm saying like we emailed at the LC draft to the email that was provided in the template, and that was pretty much it. So I'm not sure if there's someone else or something else. I'll include that information in the email I sent to IR info. But yeah, I would really appreciate any kind of like resolution we can make before the 21st deadline that allows you a cure period.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
And just to remind everybody, we've been trying to get everybody to move on these things sooner than later because the PTOs are just going to be swamped, just as the ISO is dealing with these at the last minute. And, so it may be difficult for the PTOs to actually deal if they just get a flood of these in the last week. So, if you haven't started this process, I strongly urge you to get going on this and get something to the PTO as soon as you can. Are there any other questions?
No other questions, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll turn it back to, I guess, Yelena. Is that right? Or is it Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Let's go to the next slide. So just an overview of the rest of the schedule. So we had our revised draft proposal meeting today. The comments will be due in 2 weeks on December 2nd. And I think there's a few days buffer in there also. In January, we'll have the draft final proposal posting, meeting, and comments due. And then in February will be the final proposal posting, meeting, and comments. And then we'll be going to the board in March. Next slide. So this is just a reminder for this December 2nd. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just with regard to the schedule on the last slide, I did want to highlight that this is a very compressed schedule. As you know, there's a lot of work that goes into each proposal as we receive your comments and try to refine the proposal so that it's something that's workable. If we need to extend this time frame at all, it would push us to the next Board of Governors meeting. So it would mean going, I believe, to the May Board of Governors meeting. So I just want everyone to understand that going into the process, that is a possibility. Right now, we're hoping to move forward on this time frame. If we need to pull elements of the proposal out that need more time to develop, we can do that. But if you have comments on, the urgency of this initiative, please feel free to put those in your comments as well. Thanks, Yelena.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, there's no board meeting in April, so May, I think end of May is the next one. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Daniel. And thank you, everybody, for all the discussion and questions and comments and the clarifications. I think we had maybe more than 40 hands raised throughout this meeting. So here's a link to the webpage and an additional email for questions, and the comments will be due on December 2nd. Next slide, just our plug for the Energy Matters blog. There was just a new one posted earlier this week, so we just have some links here. So thank you everybody for participating on a Friday. Have a good weekend, and thank you for joining us.